Elden Ring lore, to sleep to vertical bar, the Shadow Realm and its forgotten lords. Welcome back, fellow seekers of forgotten truths. Before we begin this journey into the shadows that lie beyond the Golden Veil, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the hidden lore of your favorite worlds. Your support helps us continue bringing these ancient mysteries to light. Tonight, we venture into a realm that exists parallel to the lands between, a place where golden light casts the darkest shadows, and where the most beloved of demigods committed acts that would make even the gods themselves recoil in horror. This is the story of the Shadow Realm, where kindness became cruelty, where love was abandoned like a discarded shell, and where the very nature of divinity reveals its most terrifying truth. Picture this. Hikakun sits empty in a blood-soaked palace. Its previous occupant vanished without explanation. The Kindly Miquella, most beloved of Queen Marika's children, has disappeared, leaving behind only confusion and an army of devoted followers whose eyes burn with an unnatural fervor. They speak of their lord's gentleness, his compassion, his dream of a kinder world. Yet something in their voices rings hollow, mechanical, as if their devotion stems not from their hearts, but from something far more insidious. In the distance, beyond a veil that separates worlds, an enormous tree stretches its twisted branches across an alien sky. The Shadow Tree, they call it. A shadow cast by the golden Erd tree itself. Beneath its oppressive canopy lies a realm of ruins and whispers, where the echoes of ancient atrocities mingle with the gentle voice of Saint Trina, begging anyone who will listen to stop the one she once loved more than life itself. But who is Saint Trina? And why does she weep for Miquella, even as his followers march toward what they believe will be paradise? Why do the very stones of this shadow realm seem to remember screams that echoed across centuries? And what connection exists between the empty cocoon, the missing demigod, and the crimson flames that once reduced an entire civilization to ash and bone? The answer lies in a truth so profound and so horrifying that it challenges everything we thought we knew about the nature of gods and mortals alike. For in the Shadow Realm, we discover that the path to divinity is not paved with noble sacrifice or righteous fury, but with the systematic abandonment of everything that makes one human. Love, doubt, fear, compassion, all discarded like shed skin as one ascends to heights that mortal minds were never meant to comprehend. This is the tale of Miquella's transformation, but it is also the story of a cycle that has repeated across ages, claiming gods and mortals alike. It is the story of Queen Marika's hidden shame, of Messmer's tormented loyalty, and of Radahn's resurrection for purposes that would make the stars themselves weep. It is a mystery wrapped in golden light and shadow magic, where every answer reveals three new questions, and where the very concept of free will becomes as fragile as morning mist. Tonight, you will walk the paths that Miquella walked, see through the eyes of his devoted followers, and slowly, horrifyingly, understand what he truly became when he shed the last vestiges of his humanity. You will witness the weight of terrible knowledge and understand why some truths are meant to remain buried in shadow. But I must warn you, dear listener, once you glimpse behind the veil of golden light, once you see the shadows it casts, you can never again look upon the gods with the same eyes. For in the Shadow Realm, we learn that divinity and monstrosity are often the same thing, viewed from different angles. The first question that will guide our journey is this. What drove the Kindly Miquella, he who was meant to bring compassion to a world grown cruel, to abandon his very capacity for love? The answer lies somewhere in the twisted branches of the Shadow Tree, in the ruins of civilizations thought forgotten, and in the desperate warnings of a saint whose love was cast aside like a broken toy. You are a scholar of forbidden histories, one of those rare souls whose hunger for truth outweighs their concern for comfort or safety. While others content themselves with the sanitized histories found in golden temples and noble courts, you seek the stories that have been deliberately buried, the truths that power would prefer remained hidden. It is this insatiable curiosity that has drawn you to the mystery of Miquella's disappearance, and ultimately to the threshold of the Shadow Realm itself. The Realm of Shadow exists parallel to the lands between, separated not by distance but by a veil woven from ancient magic and divine will. It is a place where the normal rules of existence bend and blur, where time moves differently, and where the very air seems thick with the weight of accumulated secrets. Unlike the lands between, where the Erd tree's golden light touches every corner of the landscape, the Shadow Realm exists in perpetual twilight, illuminated only by the ethereal glow that emanates from the massive Scato tree. The Scato tree dominates the realm like a cosmic parasite, its enormous trunk rising impossibly high into a sky that seems more concept than reality. Its bark appears almost black against the strange twilight, yet it pulses with a faint, sickly luminescence that creates shifting patterns of shadow and half-light across the landscape below. The tree's branches stretch in all directions, creating a canopy so vast and dense that in some regions no natural light penetrates to the ground at all. Yet this is not the comforting darkness of night, but something far more unsettling, a darkness that seems aware, watchful, pregnant with whispered secrets and half-remembered screams. Beneath this oppressive canopy, the Shadow Realm reveals itself as a land of contradictions. Ancient cities rise from the mist-shrouded earth, their architecture alien yet hauntingly familiar. These are the ruins of the Hornsent civilization, a people whose very name has been nearly erased from the histories of the lands between. Their buildings are constructed from a strange dark stone that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating structures that appear to exist in their own pocket of deeper shadow. Spiraling towers twist toward the Scato tree's branches, their surfaces carved with intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if the stone itself remembers the pain of its creator's final moments. Golden mist drifts through the ruins, like the breath of sleeping gods, carrying with it whispers and languages that predate the Golden Order. Sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can almost make out words in these whispers, fragments of prayers or pleas that echo with such profound desperation that they make your heart race with sympathetic panic. The mist has a strange quality to it, seeming to respond to emotion and thought, growing thicker around areas of particular significance, as if the very atmosphere of this realm is trying to guide or perhaps mislead those who walk its paths. Your companions on this journey are as complex as the mystery you seek to unravel. There is Leda, one of Miquella's most devoted followers, whose unwavering faith has carried her across the veil into this Shadow Realm. She speaks of her Lord with a reverence that borders on worship, her eyes lighting up with an almost supernatural fervor whenever his name is mentioned. Yet there are moments, brief flickers of doubt that cross her features when she thinks no one is watching, as if some deeper part of her recognizes that something fundamental has changed about the one she serves. Ansbach presents a stark contrast to Leda's blind devotion. Once a follower as faithful as any, he has begun to question the nature of Miquella's transformation, to wonder whether the path their Lord has chosen truly leads to the gentle world they all believed they were helping to create. His questions are carefully phrased, diplomatically worded, but they carry the weight of genuine concern and growing horror at what he has witnessed. In quiet moments, he speaks of dreams that feel more like memories, visions of his Lord discarding pieces of himself like unwanted clothing, each abandonment making him less human, and more something else entirely. Most mysterious of all are the spectral figures that occasionally materialize from the golden mist. The ghostly remnants of Hornsent survivors whose civilization was systematically destroyed generations ago. They speak in fragments, their words often cutting off mid-sentence as if the trauma of their final moments continues to interrupt their thoughts even in death. Through their broken testimonies, you begin to piece together a picture of horror that spans centuries. A deliberate campaign of extermination carried out in the name of divine justice, yet motivated by something far more personal and far more terrible. The veil between worlds is not merely a barrier, but a filter, allowing only certain kinds of truth to pass through in either direction. As you crossed from the lands between into this shadow realm, you felt something shift within your very perception, as if layers of comfortable illusion were being peeled away to reveal the raw, unfiltered nature of reality beneath. Colors seem more vivid here, yet also somehow wrong, as if you are seeing spectrums of light that were never meant for mortal eyes. Sounds carry further and seem to echo with meanings beyond their surface content, creating a constant sense that you are overhearing conversations meant for other ears. Your connection to the greater will, that cosmic force that supposedly governs all existence, feels different here as well. Instead of the warm, golden presence that faithful describe, you sense something colder, more calculating, as if the very force that claims to love and protect its children is studying you with the detached interest of a scholar, examining an interesting specimen. This realization brings with it a growing understanding that the truths you seek may challenge not just your understanding of Miquella's story, but the very foundations of everything you thought you knew about the nature of divinity itself. The emotional theme that will guide this journey resonates through every aspect of the Shadow Realm, woven into its very fabric, like golden thread through dark cloth. This is the story of the price of perfection, of what must be sacrificed to achieve the impossible dream of a world without suffering. Yet, as you will discover, the elimination of pain often requires the elimination of everything that makes existence meaningful, leaving behind only a hollow shell wearing the mask of paradise. The mystery that would ultimately draw you into the Shadow Realm began not with grand revelations or prophetic visions, but with an absence that spoke louder than any presence ever could. In the depths of Mohg's palace, past the rivers of cursed blood, and the twisted architecture of obsession, sits an empty cocoon. This is where the story should have ended, where Miquella should have emerged as the god his followers believed him destined to become. Instead, you found only hollow silk and the lingering scent of something indefinably wrong. The cocoon itself defies easy description. Its surface appears to be woven from threads of pure gold, yet when touched, it feels more like hardened dreams than any earthly material. The interior still bears the impression of a form that once rested within, but that impression seems strangely incomplete, as if whatever emerged did so by leaving essential parts of itself behind. Scattered around the base of the cocoon are objects that tell a story of transformation, but not the kind the faithful had hoped for. A small pile of golden hair, still warm to the touch despite being severed from its owner. Fragments of what might once have been tears, crystallized into gems that pulse with their own inner light. And most disturbing of all, a child's toy, carved from Miquella wood, cracked down the middle as if something within had tried to escape. Your investigation of these strange artifacts led you to ancient texts that spoke of Empyrean transformations, documents so forbidden that merely possessing them was considered heretical by the Golden Order. These grimoires, written in languages that seem to shift and change even as you read them, describe the process by which certain chosen beings could ascend to true godhood. Yet the more you studied these accounts, the more you realized that ascension was perhaps the wrong word entirely. What these texts described was not elevation but evacuation, the systematic emptying of everything that made the candidate human in order to create space for something far greater and far more terrible to take residence. The first hints of what had truly happened to Miquella came through dreams that felt more real than waking life. In these visions, you walked through landscapes that existed nowhere in the lands between, places where the golden light of the Erd tree cast shadows so deep they seemed to have weight and substance. In these shadow places, you heard a voice calling out in desperation, a woman's voice that spoke with the authority of saints, yet carried the pain of the abandoned. This was Saint Trina, though you did not yet understand her true significance or her connection to the missing demigod. Saint Trina's voice carried warnings wrapped in riddles, prophecies disguised as lullabies. She spoke of a kindly Lord who had forgotten how to be kind, of love discarded like a worn-out cloak, of followers whose devotion had been purchased rather than earned. Most disturbing of all, she warned of a plan that spanned realms, involving the resurrection of heroes thought long dead, and the manipulation of cosmic forces that were never meant to bend to mortal will. The celestial alignments mentioned in the ancient texts began to make terrifying sense as you studied the movements of the stars above the lands between. Radahn's constellation, which should have remained fixed in the cosmic order following his death, had begun to move again, tracing patterns across the night sky that corresponded exactly to the resurrection rituals described in the forbidden grimoires. Someone was calling back the star scourge, but not out of mercy or justice. The magical formula required for such a feat demanded something far more sinister, a divine will powerful enough to override death itself, yet twisted enough to use that power for purposes the original hero would never have consented to. As these revelations accumulated, you began to experience what the text called the Empyrean calling, a supernatural compulsion that draws mortals toward divine mysteries, whether they will it or not. This was not mere curiosity amplified, but something that seemed to rewrite your very desires, making the pursuit of this particular truth feel more important than food, sleep, or self-preservation. You found yourself spending hours staring at maps of places that officially did not exist, tracing with your fingers the routes that led not to geographic destinations, but to states of being that mortal minds were never meant to comprehend. The emotional weight of accepting this quest manifested in a moment of perfect clarity that came during a meditation beneath the Erd tree's roots. As you sat in that sacred space, surrounded by the golden light that had guided your world for ages beyond counting, you suddenly understood that everything you had believed about the nature of divinity was not merely incomplete, but deliberately constructed to hide a truth so profound that knowledge of it could drive mortals to madness. The Golden Order, the Erd Tree, the very concept of grace that guided the lives of all who dwelt in the lands between, all of it was built upon foundations that would crumble if subjected to honest examination. In that moment of realization, you felt the veil between worlds thin, almost to the breaking point. Through that gossamer barrier, you glimpsed the shadow realm in all its terrible beauty, saw the Scato tree stretching its branches toward a sky that was not quite sky, witnessed the ruins of civilizations that had been erased not just from maps but from memory itself. And walking through those ruins, leaving no footprints on the shadow-touched ground, you saw a figure that might once have been Miquella, but was now something else entirely. Something that wore kindness like a mask, while its true face remained hidden beneath layers of divine transformation. The personal stakes of this journey crystallized around a single horrifying question. If Miquella, the most compassionate of all the demigods, could be transformed into something that felt no genuine love for the followers who worshipped him, what did that say about the nature of godhood itself? Were the gods truly the benevolent guardians that mortals believed them to be? Or were they something far more alien, beings so removed from human experience that their idea of love and their idea of manipulation had become indistinguishable? Your companions felt the call as well, each in their own way. Leda's devotion intensified to an almost painful degree, as if she were trying to convince herself through sheer force of will that her faith remained justified. Ansbach's questions multiplied, his diplomatic veneer cracking under the weight of implications he could no longer ignore, and in the golden mist that had begun to follow you wherever you went, the spectral Hornsent grew more solid, their fragmented warnings becoming clearer and more urgent with each passing day. The moment of acceptance came not as a dramatic declaration but as a quiet surrender to inevitability. Standing at the threshold between worlds, feeling the Shadow Realm's alien atmosphere pressing against the barrier that separated it from mundane reality, you simply stepped forward. The veil parted like water, welcoming you into a realm where truth wore no comforting disguises, and where the price of knowledge was measured not in gold or blood, but in the loss of every comforting illusion you had ever harbored about the nature of existence itself. As you crossed into shadow, you felt something fundamental shift within your very being, as if crossing that threshold had marked you in ways that would never fully heal. Behind you, the familiar light of the Erd tree seemed suddenly distant and cold, while ahead, the twisted branches of the Skeda tree beckoned with the promise of answers that you were no longer certain you truly wanted to find. The first sensation upon entering the Shadow Realm was not one of sight or sound, but of weight. The very air seemed heavier here, pregnant with accumulated secrets, and the residue of ancient sorrows. Your breath came slower, not from any physical difficulty, but because the atmosphere itself seemed to demand a more deliberate, more reverent approach to existence. Each step forward required conscious effort, as if the realm was testing your commitment to uncovering its truths. The path that Miquella had taken was not difficult to follow, for his passage had left marks that transcended the physical. Where his feet had touched the shadow-touched earth, flowers bloomed that existed nowhere else in any realm, their petals simultaneously beautiful and deeply unsettling. These Miquella lilies, as his followers reverently called them, grew in perfect geometric patterns that spoke of divine influence, yet their fragrance carried undertones of something clinical, sterile, devoid of the chaotic beauty that characterized natural growth. Your first encounter with Miquella's abandoned followers came at what had once been a crossroads, though the paths that met there led to destinations that could not be found on any map of the lands between. A group of knights knelt in perfect formation around a makeshift shrine, their armor bearing the insignia of the Halig tree, but somehow changed, the golden decorations now seeming to pulse with their own inner light. They spoke in unison when they noticed your approach, their voices harmonizing in ways that human voices should not be able to achieve. "Our Lord has passed this way," they intoned, their words carrying an odd echo that seemed to come from somewhere beyond their physical forms. "He walks the path of ascension, shedding the burdens that have long weighed upon his divine spirit. We await his return, when he shall grace us with his perfected presence and lead us to the gentle world he has promised." Yet, even as they spoke these words of devotion, you noticed the confusion in their eyes, the way their hands occasionally moved to touch their hearts, as if searching for something that was no longer there. When questioned about their Lord's specific whereabouts or intentions, their responses became increasingly mechanical, falling into repetitive patterns that suggested their understanding of their own mission was far from complete. The Fire Knights presented an even more complex mystery. These warriors served not Miquella, but Messmer, the demigod, whose very name had been struck from most historical records. They moved through the Shadow Realm, like ghosts of a war that had never officially ended, their crimson flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to tell stories of their own. Unlike Miquella's followers, the Fire Knights showed no confusion about their purpose, only a deep, abiding weariness that spoke of centuries spent carrying out orders they understood all too well. Captain Marika, their leader, was the first to speak directly to your party, rather than around you. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much, and understood more than he wished. "You seek the kindly Lord," he said, "though you had not yet revealed your purpose. Many have passed this way with the same hunger in their eyes. Few return unchanged, and fewer still return at all. The path he walks leads to places that were never meant for mortal feet to tread." When pressed for more specific information, Marika's responses revealed the first glimpse of the larger pattern you had come to investigate. Messmer's crusade, he explained, had not ended with the destruction of the Hornsent civilization. It had simply changed focus, becoming a vigil against something far more dangerous than any earthly enemy. The Fire Knights now served as wardens of sorts, ensuring that certain boundaries remained unbreached, and certain truths remained buried beneath layers of ash and time. The establishment of your party's dynamics began in earnest during these early encounters. Lida's interactions with both groups revealed the depth of the changes that following Miquella had wrought in his disciples. She spoke to his kneeling knights with an authority that seemed to flow directly from her connection to their lord, yet even she could not entirely explain the source of the compulsion that had driven them all to cross into the Shadow Realm. Her faith remained absolute, but cracks were beginning to show in her certainty about what that faith truly meant. Ansbach proved more willing to engage with the Fire Knights, perhaps recognizing in their weary duty something that resonated with his own growing doubts. His conversations with them revealed a man grappling with the realization that loyalty and wisdom were not always compatible, that sometimes the most faithful service required questioning the very foundations of what one served. The knights, in turn, seemed to see in him a kindred spirit, someone who understood the burden of carrying out necessary tasks that brought no joy or satisfaction. The spectral Hornsent, who had begun following your group, grew more solid and more communicative as you moved deeper into their ancestral realm. Through their fragmented testimonies, you began to understand that the Shadow Realm was not merely a parallel dimension, but a repository, a place where the consequences of divine actions accumulated like sediment at the bottom of a deep well. Every choice made by gods and demigods left traces here, creating a record that could not be altered or destroyed by earthly power. The moment that truly marked your transition from the mundane world into the realm of cosmic mystery came at the foot of a massive stone archway that stood alone in a field of crystallized tears. The archway bore no inscriptions or decorations, yet its very presence seemed to warp the space around it, creating visual distortions that made it appear simultaneously ancient beyond measure and freshly carved from living stone. As your party approached the arch, the air itself began to sing, producing harmonies that seemed to emanate from the molecular structure of reality itself, rather than any earthly source. The sound was beautiful beyond description, yet it carried within it an undertone of profound sadness, as if the very atoms of existence were mourning for something that had been lost forever. Passing through the archway felt like being born into a new world while simultaneously dying to the old one. On the far side, the Shadow Realm revealed its true nature as a place where physical laws bent to accommodate truths too large for normal reality to contain. The Shadow Tree's branches stretched overhead like the ribs of some cosmic cathedral, their shadows creating patterns on the ground that moved independent of any wind or light source. Here, surrounded by the accumulated weight of divine secrets and the whispered testimony of the realm's ghostly inhabitants, you understood that your journey had truly begun. Whatever answers lay ahead would exact a price, measured not in blood or gold, but in the comfortable certainties that had once made existence bearable. The path forward led through ruins that remembered their own destruction, and past guardians who protected secrets they could no longer fully comprehend, toward a confrontation with truths that would challenge the very foundation of everything you had believed about the nature of gods, mortals, and the relationship between them. The ruins of Belleroth emerged from the ethereal mist, like the skeleton of a dream, half remembered upon waking. This ancient city of the Hornsent stretched across a vast plateau, its dark stone architecture rising in spiraling towers that seemed to defy conventional understanding of structural engineering. The buildings appeared to have been grown rather than built, their surfaces flowing and organic, despite being carved from stone harder than diamond. Every surface bore intricate carvings that depicted scenes of daily life from a civilization that had thrived here for millennia before being systematically erased from existence. Your first major discovery came in what had once been Belleroth's great library, though calling it a library failed to capture the true nature of the space. The Hornsent had not merely stored books here, but had somehow crystallized knowledge itself into formations that grew from floor and ceiling, like reverse stalactites. These knowledge crystals hummed with accumulated wisdom, their surfaces displaying moving images of historical events when touched by hands that approached them with proper reverence. Through these crystallized memories, you witnessed fragments of Miquella's passage through this place. The images showed him moving through the ruins with a procession of followers. But what struck you most was not their number or their devotion, but the strange quality of their movement. They walked in perfect synchronization, their steps falling with mechanical precision, their heads turning at identical angles to observe the same architectural details. This was not the natural behavior of a diverse group of individuals, but something far more unsettling, as if they had all become components in a single larger organism. But it was at the center of Belleroth, in a circular plaza dominated by a massive stone tree whose branches bore fruit made of crystallized sorrow, that you made your first truly significant discovery. Here, partially buried beneath centuries of accumulated shadow dust, lay fragments of what could only be described as discarded essence. The first piece appeared to be a small, translucent sphere that pulsed with its own inner light, warm to the touch, and somehow familiar, despite being unlike anything you had ever encountered. Leda recognized it immediately, her face paling as understanding dawned. "This is our Lord's doubt," she whispered, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and horror. I felt it leave him when we reached the walls of Castle Insis. He spoke of it as a burden that would no longer be necessary, but I never imagined it would take physical form. The sphere of crystallized doubt told a story through the emotions it evoked in those who held it. You experienced flashes of Miquella's internal struggle, moments when the young demigod had questioned whether his path truly led to the gentle world he promised his followers. These were not the doubts of a coward, but of someone who understood the weight of the choices he was making, and wondered whether the price he was paying was worth the paradise he sought to create. More disturbing than the doubt itself was the realization of what its absence meant. A being without doubt could not truly be said to possess wisdom, for doubt was the quality that prevented certainty from becoming tyranny. Without it, even the most benevolent intentions could justify acts of incredible cruelty, all in service of an unquestioned greater good. Your exploration of the surrounding ruins revealed evidence of systematic destruction that painted a horrifying picture of the Shadow Realm's recent history. The Hornsent had not simply been conquered. They had been methodically eliminated with a thoroughness that suggested divine involvement. Buildings showed signs of having been destroyed, not by conventional warfare, but by something that attacked the very concept of their existence, leaving behind ruins that somehow remembered their own annihilation. The spectral visions that began to manifest in areas of particular significance showed fragments of the final days of Hornsent civilization. You witnessed families being torn apart, not by soldiers, but by their own transformed kin, people whose eyes had been filled with the same unnatural fervor you recognized in Miquella's most devoted followers. The Hornsent had been made to participate in their own destruction, convinced through divine compulsion that their deaths were necessary for the greater good. In the ruins of what had once been a temple to the primordial crucible, you encountered your first pot saint. Though the term saint seemed grotesquely inappropriate for what you found, the creature had once been human, but its form had been compressed and reshaped into something that resembled a living jar, its features still recognizable but horribly distorted by the transformation process. It spoke in a voice like grinding stone, telling fragmented stories of ascension rituals that promised divine enlightenment, but delivered only agony and loss of self. The pot saint's testimony revealed that the Hornsent's religious practices had centered around the belief that suffering could be distilled and purified, transformed into something beautiful and transcendent. Their saints had voluntarily undergone transformations that crushed their bodies into new forms, believing that this physical compression would expand their spiritual capacity. The parallels to what you suspected was happening to Miquella and his followers were impossible to ignore. As your investigation continued, the spectral Hornsent, who had been following your group, began to speak more coherently. Their fragmented words, weaving together into testimony that chilled you to the bone. They spoke of a great burning, of flames that consumed not just flesh and stone, but memory itself. They described watching their own histories being rewritten in real time, their cultural achievements attributed to other peoples, their very names being struck from the records of the world. Most significantly, they spoke of the one who had ordered their destruction, describing Queen Marika not as the benevolent mother goddess portrayed in Golden Order scripture, but as a figure consumed by ancient rage and the desire for revenge. The Hornsent had once captured members of Marika's shamanic people, subjecting them to the same pot saint rituals they practiced on themselves. Marika's ascension to godhood had apparently not dimmed her desire for vengeance, merely given her the power to pursue it on a cosmic scale. The emotional weight of these discoveries began to affect your companions in different ways. Leda's devotion to Miquella intensified, but it took on a desperate quality, as if she were trying to convince herself that her lord's transformation was still guided by compassion rather than something far colder. She began to speak of doubt and fear as weaknesses that needed to be overcome, echoing phrases that seemed to come from beyond her own thoughts. Ansbach grew quieter and more contemplative, his questions becoming more pointed and harder for Leda to dismiss. He began to document what you were discovering, creating a record that he said was necessary for those who would come after. His growing horror at the implications of your findings was tempered by a scholar's appreciation for the magnitude of the truth you were uncovering. The character interactions during this phase of exploration revealed the stress that forbidden knowledge places on even the strongest relationships. Arguments broke out over interpretation of evidence, with each member of your party bringing their own biases and fears to bear on what you were learning. Yet these conflicts also deepened your understanding of each other and of the mystery you were pursuing. The section concluded with your most significant cliffhanger yet. Deep within the ruins of Bellerat's innermost sanctum, you discovered a chamber that had been sealed with magic so powerful that even the destruction of the surrounding city had not breached it. The seals bore Miquella's personal sigil, but they had been placed from the inside, as if he had wanted to ensure that something within could never escape. As Ansbach worked to decipher the magical locks, The chamber began to emit a sound that was part whisper, part sob, and part song. It was a voice you recognized from your dreams, Saint Trina's voice, calling out from beyond the sealed door, with words that made your heart race with sympathetic terror. "Do not let him reach the gate," she pleaded, her voice growing stronger as the seals weakened. "Stop him before he becomes something that cannot remember what it means to love." The implications of finding Saint Trina imprisoned here, sealed away by the very person she was trying to warn you against, cast everything you thought you knew about Miquella's transformation in a new and deeply disturbing light. As the final seal began to crack under Ansbach's careful ministrations, you realized that you were about to confront not just another piece of the puzzle, but potentially the most important witness to the truth you sought. Assuming she had not been driven mad by centuries of imprisonment in absolute darkness, the chamber door swung open with a sound like the universe taking its first breath, and from within emerged not the imprisoned saint you had expected, but something far more complex and infinitely more tragic. Saint Trina appeared as a figure caught between states of being, her form shifting between the solid and the ethereal, like candlelight seen through moving water. Her face bore features that seemed hauntingly familiar, though you could not immediately place where you might have encountered them before. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of centuries spent in contemplation of a single overwhelming truth. "You seek to understand what has become of Miquella," she said, her words resonating with harmonics that seemed to bypass your ears entirely and speak directly to your soul. "I have watched his transformation from the beginning, and I tell you now that what you see as abandonment, he sees as purification. What you interpret as cruelty, he understands as necessity. The kindly Lord has not lost his compassion, but has elevated it beyond the limitations of mortal understanding." This initial explanation provided a framework that seemed to resolve many of the disturbing discoveries you had made. Saint Trina painted a picture of Miquella's journey as a necessary evolution, a transcendence of human limitations in service of a greater good that mortal minds could not fully comprehend. The doubt he had discarded at Bellerot, she explained, was not wisdom but weakness, a flaw that would have prevented him from making the difficult choices required to heal a broken world. Leda seized upon this interpretation with visible relief, her faith vindicated by the testimony of this holy figure. "I knew our Lord's actions served a higher purpose," she declared, her voice ringing with renewed conviction. "The doubts I have been experiencing are merely my own limitations, my failure to understand the magnitude of his divine plan." Yet even as Saint Trina offered this seemingly comforting explanation, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge in her testimony. When pressed for specific details about Miquella's ultimate goals, her answers became evasive, circular, as if she were reciting carefully rehearsed responses rather than speaking from direct knowledge. More disturbing still were the moments when her composure would crack, revealing flashes of an agony so profound that it seemed to bend the very air around her. The evidence you had gathered seemed to support this interpretation of Miquella's transformation as divine evolution. His followers' synchronized behavior could be understood as the natural result of being touched by a higher consciousness, their individual quirks and flaws smoothed away in service of perfect harmony. The destruction of the Hornsent civilization, when viewed through this lens, became not genocide but necessary correction, the removal of a corrupting influence that would have prevented the establishment of a truly gentle world. Ansbach, however, remained skeptical of this tidy explanation. His questions grew more pointed as Saint Trina's account continued, focusing on details that did not quite align with her version of events. "If Miquella's transformation represents perfect compassion," he asked, "why do his most devoted followers speak of him with voices that sound more like echoes than expressions of genuine feeling?" Why do they move with such mechanical precision that they barely seem human anymore? Saint Trina's responses to such questions revealed the first cracks in her carefully constructed narrative. She would pause, her form flickering between states of solidity, as if the effort of maintaining her explanation was requiring more energy than she possessed. During these moments, different words would slip through, fragments of warnings and pleas that contradicted everything she had just told you. "He was so beautiful," she would whisper during these lapses, her voice taking on a quality of infinite loss. Before he learned that love was weakness, before he decided that kindness required the absence of choice. I remember when he would weep for every flower that withered, when the thought of causing pain to any living thing would keep him awake through entire nights. What has he become that he can discard such feelings like worn clothing? These contradictory moments were brief, quickly covered by returns to her official explanation, but they planted seeds of doubt that grew stronger with each repetition. The companions began to watch Saint Trina more carefully, noting the way her form became less stable whenever she spoke of Miquella's current state, as if the very act of defending his transformation was causing her physical distress. The red herrings that emerged during this phase of investigation were particularly insidious because they contained elements of genuine truth wrapped around cores of deliberate misdirection. The followers' testimonies of Miquella's kindness, when examined closely, revealed patterns that suggested their memories had been subtly altered. They spoke of specific acts of compassion, but the details never quite aligned, as if they were all remembering the same carefully constructed fiction rather than diverse personal experiences. The magical resonances you detected throughout the Shadow Realm supported the theory of Miquella's divine ascension, showing traces of power that far exceeded anything a mere demigod should have been able to wield. Yet these same resonances carried undertones that spoke not of love expanded beyond mortal comprehension, but of love systematically drained away, leaving behind only the hollow shell of benevolent intention without the emotional substance that gave such intentions meaning. During an extended conversation around a campfire made from crystallized memories, the emotional tension between different interpretations of what you were discovering reached its peak. Saint Trina spoke at length about the necessity of sacrifice in achieving true godhood, explaining how Miquella's abandonment of doubt and fear represented not loss, but liberation from the limitations that prevented gods from acting decisively in the face of cosmic threats. Yet as she spoke, her own form continued to destabilize, and her voice began to carry harmonics that suggested she was not speaking entirely of her own free will. The words seemed to be coming from somewhere else, using her as a conduit for ideas that caused her visible pain to express. During moments when the external influence seemed to weaken, glimpses of her true thoughts would surface, revealing a being trapped in a kind of spiritual prison, forced to advocate for positions that filled her with horror. The most disturbing aspect of this false resolution was how seductive it proved to be. The idea that Miquella's transformation represented divine evolution rather than moral decay offered a framework that made sense of the evidence, while preserving the possibility that his ultimate goals remained benevolent. This interpretation allowed his followers to maintain their faith while acknowledging the unsettling changes they had witnessed. Even Ansbach found himself temporarily swayed by this explanation, recognizing the logical elegance of Saint Trina's account. If gods truly operated according to principles beyond mortal understanding, then what appeared to be cruelty from a human perspective might indeed represent perfect compassion as viewed from a divine one. The synchronized behavior of Miquella's followers could be seen not as loss of individuality, but as achievement of perfect harmony, their mechanical devotion representing not compulsion, but willing surrender to a higher purpose. Yet the very perfection of this explanation began to feel suspicious as the conversation continued. Real truth, in your experience, was messy and incomplete, full of contradictions and loose ends that refused to resolve into neat patterns. Saint Trina's account was too clean, too comprehensive, addressing every concern with responses that felt manufactured rather than discovered. As the night wore on, and the false fire cast its wavering light across faces marked by uncertainty and growing dread, you began to understand that you had encountered not the truth, but something far more dangerous. A truth carefully crafted to prevent you from seeking the real answers that lay deeper in the Shadow Realm's twisted heart. Saint Trina's imprisonment had not been meant to silence her warnings, but to transform her into an unwilling advocate for the very transformation she had tried to prevent. The section concluded with the growing realization that Miquella's influence extended even here, even to those who claimed to oppose his methods. If Saint Trina herself could be made to speak in defense of his transformation, what hope did any of you have of maintaining your own independent judgment as you ventured deeper into his domain? The ascent to Scado Altus revealed the Shadow Realm's true scale and the magnitude of the devastation that had been wrought upon it. From the elevated plateau you could see for impossible distances across landscapes that defied conventional geography. Rivers of liquid starlight wound between mountains that appeared to be carved from crystallized time itself, while forests of trees that grew downward from an inverted canopy created pockets of reality where up and down became matters of perspective rather than fixed natural law. Yet for all its otherworldly beauty, the realm bore scars that spoke of systematic violence carried out with divine authority. Entire valleys had been scoured clean of life, their surfaces still bearing the heat shadows of flames that had burned with temperatures beyond anything achievable through mundane means. These were not the random destructions of war, but the methodical elimination of specific targets, carried out with a precision that suggested intimate knowledge of what needed to be erased and why. The specimen storehouse emerged from the mists like a monument to clinical detachment, its architecture designed not for beauty or comfort, but for the efficient cataloging of horrors. The building stretched across several acres, its countless chambers connected by corridors that seemed to extend far beyond what the external dimensions could possibly contain. Each room housed carefully preserved evidence of Messmer's crusade, documented with the thoroughness of scholars and the emotional distance of those who had learned to stop seeing their subjects as formerly human. Row upon row of glass containers held specimens that told the story of the Hornsent's final days. Here were preserved examples of their unique physiology, their cultural artifacts, even recordings of their final words captured in crystalline matrices that played back their voices when exposed to specific magical frequencies. The clinical labels attached to each specimen spoke of scientific curiosity, but the sheer comprehensiveness of the collection revealed something far more disturbing: the systematic elimination of an entire people, documented for posterity with the detached fascination of natural historians studying extinct species. And Spock's reaction to the specimen storehouse provided the first clear indication that his faith in the righteousness of divine action was beginning to crack. As he examined jar after jar of preserved Hornsent remains, his face grew progressively paler, his hands beginning to shake with suppressed emotion. "This is not justice," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the subtle humming of the preservation spells that kept the specimens fresh for examination. "This is not even war. This is something else entirely, something that wears the mask of necessity while serving purposes that have nothing to do with protecting anyone." The deeper you ventured into the storehouse's archives, the more apparent it became that the Hornsent's destruction had been motivated not by their actions, but by their knowledge. They had understood something about the nature of divine transformation, something about the true cost of achieving godhood, and that understanding had marked them for elimination. The pot saint rituals that had horrified you when you first learned of them were revealed to be crude attempts to replicate a process that the Hornsent had witnessed being carried out by divine beings themselves. The connection between the Hornsent's religious practices and the Empyrean transformation process became undeniably clear when you discovered the chamber dedicated to Marika's early history. Here, preserved in magical stasis, were records of her time among the shamanic tribes that had preceded the Golden Order. The documents described her not as a goddess born to rule, but as a survivor of the same pot saint, rituals that her followers would later use to justify the Hornsent's extermination. Marika's shamanic people had been taken by Hornsent raiders, subjected to the compression rituals that were supposed to elevate consciousness by destroying the physical form. Most had died in agony, their bodies unable to withstand the transformation process. But a few, including the young woman who would become Queen Marika, had survived the attempt, their forms permanently altered by the experience. The goddess, who would later establish the Golden Order, had herself been a victim of the very practices she would use to justify genocide centuries later. This revelation cast Messmer's crusade in an entirely new light. His actions had not been motivated by abstract justice, but by his mother's desire for revenge, her need to eliminate the people who had tortured her and her kin in the name of spiritual advancement. The base serpent that had cursed him was not a random affliction, but a deliberate choice. Marika binding him with the power necessary to carry out her vengeance while ensuring that he would bear the moral burden of her crimes. The emotional complexity of Messmer's position became apparent through the personal journals you discovered in his private chambers. Here was a being who understood exactly what he had been created to do, who recognized the injustice of punishing an entire civilization for the crimes of their ancestors, yet who could not escape the compulsions that drove him to continue his mother's work. His loyalty to Marika was not blind devotion but conscious martyrdom, the willing sacrifice of his own moral standing in service of someone he knew had been deeply wounded by her experiences. "I am the fire that burns away the sins of the past," he had written in one particularly revealing passage, "but fire consumes the innocent along with the guilty. And I have long since stopped pretending that what I do serves any purpose beyond satisfying the rage of a goddess who learned cruelty from those she now punishes for teaching it to her. I am my mother's shadow, cast by light too bright for mortal eyes to bear, and in that shadow I carry out acts that she cannot allow herself to remember commanding." The spectral Hornsent, who had been following your group, grew more agitated as you explored the storehouse, their forms flickering between states of barely contained rage and profound despair. Through their fragmented testimonies, you learned that they were not merely the ghosts of the dead, but the accumulated memories of an entire civilization, bound to the shadow realm by the magnitude of the injustice that had been done to them. They existed in a state of perpetual witness, forced to observe the consequences of their destruction while remaining powerless to intervene. Yet even as you uncovered the full scope of the Hornsent's suffering, patterns began to emerge that suggested their own practices had not been entirely innocent. The pot saint rituals they had inflicted on Marika's people were revealed to be part of a larger theological system that viewed suffering as a currency that could be spent to purchase divine favor. They had genuinely believed that by compressing consciousness through physical agony, they were creating beings capable of communing directly with cosmic forces beyond mortal comprehension. The moral complexity of the situation deepened as you realized that both sides of this ancient conflict had been pursuing the same fundamental goal: transcendence of human limitations through the systematic destruction of everything that made them human. The Hornsent had sought to achieve this through religious ritual, while Marika had pursued it through the political establishment of the Golden Order, but the underlying impulse was identical in both cases. The discovery of Miquella's second abandoned essence came during a moment of quiet reflection in the storehouse's memorial garden, a space that Messmer had created to honor the dead of both sides of his crusade. Here, beneath trees whose leaves bore the names of every person who had died in the Shadow Realm's conflicts, you found another crystallized sphere, this one pulsing with a different quality of light than the doubt you had discovered at Bellerat. This sphere contained Miquella's fear, and holding it allowed you to experience the terror that had driven him to begin his transformation process. Through the crystallized emotion, you felt his horror at the cyclical nature of divine violence, his understanding that gods and mortals were locked in patterns of mutual destruction that seemed impossible to break. His fear had not been of death or pain, but of perpetuating the same cycles that had led to tragedies like the Hornsent genocide, of becoming another link in an endless chain of divine beings who justified atrocities through claims of higher purpose. The abandonment of this fear represented a crucial step in Miquella's transformation, but it also marked the moment when he had stopped being capable of recognizing the parallels between his own actions and those of the divine beings he sought to surpass. Without fear to temper his ambitions, he had become capable of pursuing his vision of a gentle world through means that were anything but gentle. As the second open loop began to emerge in your investigation, you started to understand that Miquella's transformation was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that stretched back through countless ages and multiple divine dynasties. Each god who had achieved true power had done so by systematically abandoning the qualities that connected them to the mortals they claimed to serve, creating beings whose idea of love and protection had become so abstracted from mortal experience as to be indistinguishable from the most refined forms of cruelty. The peaceful interlude that concluded this section came during a rest, beside one of the Shadow Realm's aurora streams, rivers of liquid light that flowed across the landscape like the visible thoughts of sleeping giants. Here, surrounded by beauty that existed beyond mortal categories of understanding, you found a moment of respite from the weight of the revelations you had been uncovering. Yet even this moment of peace carried undertones of unease, for the aurora streams themselves were revealed to be the accumulated dreams of all who had died in the Shadow Realm's conflicts, their final thoughts given visible form and eternal persistence. The beauty that surrounded you was built from the hopes and fears of the dead, a reminder that even transcendence in this realm came at a cost measured in the currency of mortal suffering. The Shadow Keep loomed before you, like a wound torn in reality itself, its obsidian walls rising from foundations that seemed to extend not into earth, but into the conceptual bedrock of existence. This was Messmer's stronghold, but calling it a castle failed to capture the true nature of the structure. It was simultaneously fortress, prison, and temple, designed to contain not just a being of immense power, but the accumulated weight of his divine mother's sins. The architecture defied conventional understanding, with corridors that stretched beyond what the external dimensions could possibly accommodate, and chambers that existed in states of spatial impossibility. Gravity here seemed negotiable, rather than absolute, with staircases that led up becoming paths that descended when viewed from different angles. The very stones that comprised the walls pulsed with a faint crimson luminescence, as if the building itself were alive and sustained by the endless flames that burned within its deepest chambers. Your first encounter within the keep came not with guards or servants, but with the base serpent itself, the ancient entity that had become so thoroughly intertwined with Messmer's existence that separating them would require destroying both. The creature manifested not as a physical presence, but as a voice that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, speaking in languages that predated human civilization, yet somehow remained perfectly comprehensible to your mind. You seek understanding of the patterns that bind gods to their chosen cruelties. The serpent whispered, its voice carrying harmonics that made your bones ache with sympathetic vibration. I have witnessed the birth of 3 divine orders, watched as each promised salvation while delivering only more refined forms of damnation. The one you call Messmer is bound to me not by curse but by choice, for he understood that carrying out his mother's vengeance would require him to become something that could bear the weight of such acts without breaking. The serpent's testimony revealed layers of cosmic history that challenged every assumption you had made about the nature of divine authority. The base serpent was not merely an ancient entity, but something far more significant, a primordial force that had existed before the first gods learned to distinguish between justice and revenge. It had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations whose names had been struck not just from history, but from the very concept of memory itself. Through the serpent's memories, you experienced fragments of Marika's transformation from shamanic survivor to divine ruler. The young woman who had endured the Hornsent pot rituals had not simply recovered from her trauma, but had been fundamentally altered by it. Her consciousness expanded beyond human limitations, while simultaneously being drained of the empathy that might have prevented her from inflicting similar suffering on others. Her ascension to godhood had required her to systematically abandon every aspect of herself that connected her to the mortals she claimed to protect. She came to me in the depths of her transformation, the serpent continued, its voice now carrying overtones of something that might have been pity if such emotions were possible for beings of its nature. She understood that achieving true divinity would require her to commit acts that her remaining human conscience could not bear to remember. So she created Messmer, binding him to me so that he might carry out her will while she maintained the fiction of innocence that allows gods to sleep peacefully despite the nightmares they inflict upon the world. The keep's deeper chambers revealed the true scope of Messmer's isolation and the weight of knowledge he carried. His private study contained not just records of the crusade he had conducted, but analyses of divine behavior patterns spanning millennia. These documents revealed him to be far more than his mother's weapon, showing instead a being of profound intelligence, who had spent centuries trying to understand the cosmic forces that drove gods to commit atrocities in the name of love. One particular manuscript, written in Messmer's own hand, contained observations that sent chills through your understanding of divine nature. The gods do not become cruel through corruption, he had written. They become cruel through perfection, through the systematic elimination of every flaw and limitation that might prevent them from acting decisively in pursuit of their vision of universal harmony. What mortals interpret as divine love is often simply divine will operating without the constraints of empathy, doubt, or moral complexity. Ansbach's reaction to these revelations marked a turning point in his understanding of the mystery you were investigating. As he read through Messmer's private thoughts, his face underwent a transformation that mirrored his internal shift from doubt to horrified certainty. This explains everything about Miquella's transformation, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He is not abandoning his humanity out of malice, but out of a genuine belief that becoming fully divine will allow him to love more perfectly than any being encumbered by mortal limitations ever could. The discovery of Miquella's connection to these ancient patterns came through examination of texts that Messmer had been collecting about other Empyrean transformations. The documents revealed that every successful ascension to true godhood had followed similar stages. First, the abandonment of doubt, then fear, then love itself, until nothing remained but pure will operating according to principles too abstract for mortal minds to comprehend. Radahn's presence in the Shadow Realm began to make terrible sense when viewed through this historical context. The Starscourge had not been resurrected out of friendship or respect, but because Miquella required a consort whose power was sufficient to anchor his transformed consciousness to physical reality. The constellation magic binding Radahn was not mere necromancy, but something far more sophisticated, a form of divine compulsion that overrode not just free will but the very concept of individual identity. The evidence for this interpretation lay in the astronomical charts Messmer had been maintaining, tracking the movement of Radahn's constellation as it responded to Miquella's manipulation. The star patterns showed clear signs of artificial influence, celestial bodies being forced into configurations that violated natural orbital mechanics. This was the work of a being whose power had grown beyond anything previously witnessed in the lands between, someone who could reshape reality itself to serve his vision of cosmic harmony. Leda's growing instability became more pronounced as these revelations accumulated. Her defense of Miquella's actions took on an increasingly desperate quality, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as her companions. Even if what we are discovering is true, she argued, does that not prove the necessity of his transformation? A world as broken as ours requires solutions that transcend mortal understanding. If achieving perfect love means abandoning imperfect love, then surely that sacrifice is justified by the paradise that will result. Yet even as she spoke these words, her behavior began to mirror that of the followers you had encountered earlier. Her movements becoming more synchronized with invisible rhythms, her voice taking on harmonics that seemed to originate from somewhere beyond her individual consciousness. The realization that Miquella's influence was affecting even her, despite her genuine devotion, added another layer of horror to your growing understanding of his transformation. The winged serpent's whispers provided the final piece of the puzzle regarding the true nature of divine ascension. This entity, even more ancient than its base counterpart, spoke of times before time when the boundaries between mortal and divine had been more fluid. When transformation between states of being occurred naturally, rather than through the violent processes that now characterized Empyrean evolution. The current system is broken, the winged serpent revealed, its voice carrying the weight of eons spent observing the corruption of natural processes. Divine ascension was never meant to require the abandonment of humanity, but its transcendence. The gods of this age have mistaken destruction for transformation, believing that they must eliminate their mortal aspects rather than elevate them. This fundamental error has created beings who possess infinite power, but finite understanding, creatures capable of reshaping reality, but incapable of comprehending why their subjects suffer under their supposedly perfect rule. The atmospheric descriptions of the Shadow Realm's deeper territories revealed landscapes that existed in states of perpetual transformation, where the accumulated dreams and nightmares of divine beings had taken physical form. Here, crystallized hopes grew like flowers from soil composed of compressed despair, while rivers of liquid memory flowed between banks lined with trees whose fruit contained the discarded emotions of ascending gods. These otherworldly environments had a profound effect on everyone who spent time within them, gradually wearing away the psychological barriers that normally prevented mortals from comprehending cosmic truths. You began to understand not just the facts of what had happened to Miquella, but the emotional reality of his transformation, the terrible loneliness that came with abandoning every quality that had once connected him to others. The section concluded with the growing realization that greater forces had been manipulating events from behind the veil of visible reality, entities whose plans span not just centuries, but entire cosmic cycles. The outer gods, those beings whose influence shaped the fundamental laws of existence itself, had been guiding Empyrean transformations according to patterns that served purposes beyond mortal comprehension. As you prepared to venture deeper into the Shadow Realm's heart, the weight of forbidden knowledge pressed against your consciousness like a physical force, demanding that you choose between the comfort of ignorance and the terrible responsibility that came with understanding the true nature of divine power and its cosmic implications. The journey to what had once been Saint Trina's sacred domain led through landscapes that seemed to exist in a state of perpetual mourning. Here, the very concept of sorrow had taken physical form, manifesting as crystalline formations that grew from the earth like frozen tears shed by the realm itself. Each step forward brought you deeper into an atmosphere so saturated with loss that breathing became an act requiring conscious effort, as if the air itself had been thickened by the weight of accumulated grief. The domain appeared before you as a garden that had once been paradise, but now existed as a monument to love deliberately destroyed. Flowers that had bloomed in colors beyond mortal perception now hung withered on their stems, their petals bearing the stains of tears that had fallen like acid rain when their divine gardener had chosen abandonment over nurturing. Ancient trees whose branches had once offered shade to weary travelers now stood bare and lifeless, their bark scarred with symbols that hurt to look at directly because they represented concepts that conscious minds were never meant to process. At the center of this devastated paradise stood a pool that reflected not light but memory, its surface showing images of what this place had been before Miquella's transformation had poisoned it with the residue of his discarded love. In those reflections, you glimpsed moments of tender care, scenes of the young demigod tending to wounded creatures with a gentleness so pure that witnessing it even secondhand brought tears to your eyes. These were memories of a being whose capacity for compassion had been so profound that it extended to every living thing in existence, from the mightiest dragons to the smallest insects. But floating at the pool's center, like a corpse in a lake, was the third and most devastating of Miquella's abandoned essences. This sphere pulsed with a light that seemed to contain entire universes of warmth and care, yet touching it brought only the crushing realization of what had been lost when its owner chose to cast it aside. This was not merely love as mortals understood it, but something far more fundamental, the basic capacity for emotional connection that made existence meaningful rather than simply functional. Ansbach was the first to reach for the sphere, and the moment his fingers made contact, his entire body convulsed as if struck by lightning. Through his connection to the crystallized emotion, you all experienced the full scope of what Miquella had abandoned. This was not just romantic love or familial affection, but the underlying force that made it possible to value anything beyond pure utility. It was the quality that allowed beauty to matter, that made suffering something to be prevented rather than simply endured, that transformed existence from mere survival into something worthy of celebration. "This is what he discarded," Ansbach whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of understanding. Not weakness, not limitation, but the very capacity that made his desire to heal the world meaningful in the first place. Without this, his vision of a gentle world becomes nothing more than efficient management of resources, compassion transformed into optimization, love reduced to the mere absence of conflict. The horror of this revelation was amplified by the gradual understanding of what it meant for Miquella's followers. Every act of devotion they had shown, every sacrifice they had made in service of his cause, had been rendered meaningless by his inability to genuinely value their dedication. They had given their lives to serve someone who no longer possessed the capacity to appreciate their gift, who saw their suffering as acceptable losses in pursuit of an abstract perfection that held no emotional significance for him. Leda's reaction to this discovery was perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. As the full implications of Miquella's transformation became clear, her faith did not crumble so much as transform into something even more desperate and hollow. "If he has transcended the need for love," she said, her voice taking on the mechanical quality you had noticed in other followers, "then surely that proves his divinity." Gods cannot be limited by mortal emotions. They must be free to act according to principles higher than feeling. Yet even as she spoke these words, tears streamed down her face, her body responding to the loss, even as her mind tried to rationalize it away. She had become a living contradiction, simultaneously mourning the absence of her Lord's love while insisting that this absence represented spiritual advancement. The sight of her struggle between emotional truth and imposed doctrine encapsulated the tragedy of all who had followed Miquella into his transformed state. The discovery of Saint Trina's true nature came through careful examination of the pool's memories, combined with testimony from the crystallized love itself. As you held the sphere, visions flooded your consciousness, showing the moment of separation, when Miquella had literally torn away the part of himself capable of genuine affection. Saint Trina was not merely connected to Miquella, but was Miquella, or rather, she represented everything about him that had been capable of authentic feeling. The separation had not been clean or surgical, but violent and traumatic, like removing an organ while the patient remained conscious. Saint Trina existed in a state of constant agony, not physical pain, but something far worse, the spiritual anguish of being severed from the being she had been part of, while retaining full awareness of what had been lost. Her warnings about stopping Miquella came not from opposition to his goals, but from intimate knowledge of what he had become in pursuit of them. "I am what he discarded," Saint Trina revealed, her form becoming more solid as proximity to her separated essence allowed her temporary coherence. "I am his capacity for genuine care, his ability to weep for those who suffer, his willingness to sacrifice his own ambitions rather than cause harm to others. He cast me aside because these qualities made it impossible for him to pursue his vision with perfect efficiency. Every time his plans required accepting casualties, every time his methods caused pain to innocents, I would interfere with doubt and hesitation and inconvenient mercy." The theological implications of this revelation were staggering. If love was not merely a quality possessed by gods, but a fundamental aspect of their nature that could be abandoned, then the entire concept of divine benevolence became suspect. How many of the gods worshipped throughout history had achieved their power through similar acts of self-amputation, systematically removing every aspect of themselves that might interfere with the ruthless pursuit of their vision of perfection? The connection between Marika's ancient trauma and Miquella's current transformation became painfully clear through Saint Trina's testimony. Both had experienced events so devastating that they had chosen to abandon their capacity for the very emotions that made such events traumatic. Marika had discarded her ability to empathize with those who suffered as she had suffered, allowing her to inflict similar torments without experiencing psychological conflict. Miquella had taken this process even further, abandoning not just empathy, but love itself. The cycle repeats because each generation of gods believes they can perfect the process. Saint Trina explained, her voice growing stronger as she spoke of the pattern that had claimed so many divine beings. They see the flaws in their predecessors' methods and convince themselves that they can achieve better results through more complete transformation. But perfection, as they understand it, always requires the elimination of qualities that make existence meaningful rather than merely functional. The revelation that Radhahn's resurrection was not an act of friendship, but a form of cosmic violation took on new dimensions when viewed through this understanding of Miquella's transformed nature. Without the capacity for genuine love, Miquella could not comprehend that forcing someone to serve as his consort against their will represented a profound betrayal of everything Radahn had stood for in life. To the transformed demigod, this was simply the most efficient method of acquiring the power necessary to implement his vision of universal harmony. The horror was compounded by the realization that Miquella genuinely believed his actions were motivated by compassion. He retained intellectual understanding of concepts like mercy and kindness, but without the emotional foundation that gave these concepts meaning, they had become abstract principles to be applied mechanically rather than felt responses to others' suffering. His idea of love had become indistinguishable from perfectly efficient management. His vision of paradise reduced to a state where all conflict had been eliminated through the complete submission of every will to his own. As the full scope of this revelation settled over your group, the very atmosphere of the Shadow Realm seemed to respond to the weight of understanding you now carried. The golden mists that had followed your journey grew thicker and more oppressive, as if the realm itself were trying to shield you from truths too devastating for mortal minds to process without breaking. Yet there was no retreat from knowledge once gained, no return to the comfortable illusions that had made existence bearable before you understood the true price of divine perfection. The section concluded with the terrifying realization that Miquella's transformation was nearing completion, that somewhere in the depths of the Shadow Realm, he was preparing to take the final step that would transform him from a being who had abandoned love into something that had never possessed the capacity for genuine feeling at all. The urgency of stopping him was no longer about preventing atrocity, but about preserving the very concept that existence could have meaning beyond mere function, that consciousness could serve purposes more profound than efficient resource management. The path deeper into the Shadow Realm led through territories where reality itself seemed to buckle under the weight of accumulated divine sins. Here, the very concept of causation had been stretched beyond recognition, creating zones where effects preceded their causes, and where the landscape rearranged itself according to the emotional resonances of those who walked upon it. Mountains rose and fell in response to the grief of passing travelers, while rivers changed course to avoid carrying water that had been touched by the tears of the divine. It was in these impossible spaces that you began to perceive the true scope of the pattern that had claimed not just Miquella but countless divine beings across ages so vast that their names had been forgotten even by the cosmos itself. The Shadow Realm was not merely a parallel dimension, but a repository, a place where the discarded aspects of ascending gods accumulated like sediment at the bottom of an endless ocean. Every sphere of abandoned emotion you had discovered was part of a vast collection, the cast-off humanity of beings who had chosen power over authenticity. The spectral Hornsent, who had been following your journey, grew more coherent as you ventured deeper into these zones of concentrated truth. Their fragmented testimonies began to weave together into a narrative that spanned not centuries but entire cosmic cycles, revealing that the civilization Messmer had destroyed had been attempting something unprecedented in the history of divine ascension. They had been trying to break the cycle, to find a method of achieving godhood that did not require the systematic destruction of everything that made consciousness worthwhile. We had learned the secret. One of the more coherent spirits explained, its voice carrying harmonics that suggested it had once been a being of considerable power. Through our pot saint rituals, through the compression of consciousness and the distillation of suffering, we had discovered that transformation was possible without abandonment. The pain was not meant to destroy humanity, but to refine it, to create beings capable of holding both divine power and mortal feeling in perfect balance. This revelation cast the destruction of the Hornsent civilization in an entirely new light. They had been eliminated, not because their practices were cruel, but because their success threatened the fundamental assumptions upon which divine power had been built for eons. If gods could achieve transcendence without abandoning their humanity, then every act of cosmic cruelty committed by their predecessors would be revealed as unnecessary, chosen rather than inevitable. Marika's motivation for ordering their extermination became horrifyingly clear through this understanding. As someone who had undergone the traditional process of divine ascension, She could not allow the existence of proof that her own transformation had been a choice rather than a necessity. The Hornsent represented living evidence that she had voluntarily abandoned her capacity for genuine feeling, that every atrocity committed in the name of the Golden Order could have been avoided if she had been willing to endure the complexity and pain that came with retaining her humanity. She feared not their cruelty, but their mercy. Another spirit testified, its form flickering between states of rage and infinite sadness. They had shown her a path she was no longer capable of walking, and rather than admit that her own transformation had been unnecessary, she chose to eliminate every trace of the alternative they represented. The genocide was not about justice for ancient wrongs, but about protecting herself from the knowledge that she had become a monster by choice rather than necessity. The connection between Marika's ancient crime and Miquella's current transformation revealed a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond individual psychology into the realm of cosmic law itself. The outer gods, those entities whose influence shaped the fundamental rules of reality, had been systematically encouraging this cycle of abandonment and cruelty, feeding on the emotional energy released when divine beings severed their connections to authentic feeling. Through careful analysis of the astronomical data Messmer had been collecting, Ansbach began to identify the signatures of outer god influence in the patterns of stellar movement that had accompanied every major divine transformation in recorded history. These cosmic entities were not merely observers of mortal affairs, but active participants, manipulating events to ensure that each generation of gods would follow the same destructive path as their predecessors. The greater will itself may be the most sophisticated of these parasitic entities, Ansbach concluded, his voice heavy with the weight of implications that challenged the very foundation of existence in the lands between. It feeds on the contrast between divine power and divine emptiness, growing stronger each time a god chooses efficiency over empathy. Every prayer offered to a loveless deity, every act of devotion given to a being incapable of genuine appreciation, generates the spiritual energy that sustains these cosmic predators. The revelation of your own hidden heritage came through exposure to the concentrated emotional residue that permeated the deepest regions of the Shadow Realm. As you walked through landscapes composed of crystallized divine abandonment, your consciousness began to resonate with frequencies that awakened memories you had never known you possessed. You were not merely a scholar drawn to forbidden knowledge, but a descendant of the shamanic traditions that had produced Queen Marika herself. This bloodline connection explained your unusual sensitivity to divine influence, and your ability to perceive truths that others found impossible to accept. But it also marked you as a potential threat to the established order, someone whose very existence challenged the narrative that transformation required abandonment. The outer gods had been aware of your true nature from the beginning, guiding your investigation not to prevent Miquella's ascension, but to ensure that you would witness it, that you would understand exactly what was being lost when he completed his transformation. Leda's complete psychological collapse came when she finally understood the true nature of her devotion. As the weight of accumulated revelation pressed against her consciousness, her carefully constructed rationalizations crumbled, revealing the hollow foundation beneath. She had not chosen to follow Miquella, but had been chosen by him, selected for her psychological vulnerability, and molded into the perfect instrument of unquestioning obedience. "I have never had a thought that was truly my own," she whispered, her voice carrying the broken quality of someone whose entire sense of identity had been revealed as artificial construction. Every feeling of love I thought I experienced, every moment of joy in his presence, every sacrifice I was willing to make, all of it was implanted by his influence. I am not a person but a puppet, and now that I understand the strings, I cannot make them disappear. The discovery of the third and most terrifying truth, came through examination of the cosmic patterns that governed Empyrean transformation. This was not merely a process that individual beings underwent, but part of a larger cycle that reset the fundamental nature of reality itself at regular intervals. Each time a sufficient number of gods abandoned their humanity, the accumulated emptiness would reach a critical mass, triggering a cosmic event that would remake existence according to principles determined by beings who had forgotten what it meant to feel. The Shadow Realm existed as a kind of cosmic buffer, a space where the discarded emotions of ascending gods were stored until they could be safely released back into the universe as raw energy. But the current cycle had produced more abandonment than any previous iteration, creating an instability that threatened to collapse the barrier between storage and release. If Miquella completed his transformation and added his discarded love to this collection, the resulting explosion of unprocessed emotion would tear through reality like acid through paper. This is why the realm responds so strongly to our presence. You realized, your understanding finally encompassing the full scope of the cosmic drama unfolding around you. We represent the last possibility for conscious intervention before the cycle completes itself. Our emotional responses to what we discover here are not merely personal reactions but active forces that could tip the balance between transformation and catastrophe. The revelation that Radhahn's resurrection was part of a much larger pattern became clear through analysis of the constellation magic binding him to Miquella's will. The star's scourge was not merely being compelled to serve as a consort, but was being transformed into a cosmic anchor, a being whose connection to the fundamental forces of gravity and stellar motion would allow Miquella to reshape reality on a galactic scale. He intends to extend his influence beyond a single world, Ansbach concluded, his analysis of the stellar patterns revealing the true ambition behind Miquella's transformation. The gentle world he envisions is not limited to the lands between, or even the Shadow Realm, but encompasses entire star systems. He plans to create a universe where every conscious being exists in perfect harmony through complete submission to his will. The horror of this vision was not its cruelty, but its efficiency. In Miquella's transformed understanding, a cosmos where no being ever experienced conflict, pain, or genuine choice would represent the ultimate expression of divine love. He retained enough intellectual comprehension of suffering to want to prevent it, but without the emotional foundation that made freedom worth preserving despite its capacity to generate pain. His solution involved the complete elimination of meaningful choice from existence. As you approach the final stages of your investigation, the weight of cosmic truth pressed against your consciousness with increasing intensity. You had uncovered not just the mystery of one demigod's transformation, but the underlying pattern that governed the relationship between power and consciousness throughout the universe. The choice facing you was no longer simply about stopping Miquella, but about determining whether existence itself would retain the capacity for authentic feeling or be transformed into a perfectly efficient but emotionally empty mechanism for preventing all possible forms of suffering. The section concluded with the terrifying realization that time was running out not just for intervention, but for choice itself. Somewhere in the deepest reaches of the Shadow Realm, at a place called the Divine Gate, where the boundaries between mortal and cosmic dissolved entirely, Miquella was preparing to complete his transformation and extend his perfected love across the entirety of creation, regardless of whether creation desired such perfection. The convening of knowledge came not in a single place, but across multiple sacred sites, scattered throughout the Shadow Realm's deepest territories, each one holding pieces of understanding that would prove essential in comprehending the full magnitude of what Miquella intended. Your journey led you first to the ruins of the ancient shamanic library, where the surviving records of Marika's original people had been preserved in crystalline matrices that pulsed with accumulated wisdom spanning countless generations. Here, among texts written in scripts that predated human language, you discover the original prophecies that had foretold the coming of beings capable of reshaping cosmic law itself. These documents described not individual transformation, but cycles of universal change, periods when the fundamental nature of existence would shift according to the will of those who had transcended mortal limitations. The current cycle was approaching its conclusion, and Miquella's ascension represented the final variable that would determine whether the next phase of reality would retain any connection to authentic emotional experience. The ancient Hornsent shamans who had managed to preserve some measure of consciousness despite their civilization's destruction shared knowledge that had been carefully hidden from every divine authority that had claimed dominion over the realms. Through their fragmented but increasingly coherent testimonies, you learned that the process of Empyrean transformation was not natural evolution but artificial modification, imposed by the outer gods as a method of harvesting the spiritual energy generated when conscious beings severed their connections to genuine feeling. The compression rituals we developed were attempts to resist this cosmic parasitism, explained Grandam Willow, the most coherent of the surviving shamanic spirits. We understood that achieving divine power through abandonment was not transcendence, but a form of spiritual death, the creation of beings with infinite capability but finite understanding. Our pot saint ceremonies were designed to expand consciousness without destroying the emotional foundation that gave that consciousness meaning. The revelation that their methods had been largely successful added another layer to the tragedy of their destruction. The Hornsent had been eliminated not because they were cruel, but because they had discovered a path to godhood that did not require the systematic elimination of everything that made existence worthwhile. Their success threatened to expose the voluntary nature of every divine atrocity committed throughout history, revealing that cruelty was not the inevitable price of power, but a choice made by beings who valued efficiency over authenticity. Saint Trina's presence grew stronger as you gathered this accumulated wisdom, her form becoming more solid as proximity to so much preserved emotion allowed her to temporarily overcome the spiritual wounds inflicted by her separation from Miquella. Through her expanded awareness, you gained access to memories that spanned the entire period of his transformation, witnessing each moment when he had chosen abandonment over growth, efficiency over complexity, perfect control over messy but authentic relationship. I felt each severance like a physical wound, she revealed, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested the depth of trauma that conscious separation from one's own capacity for love could inflict. When he discarded his doubt at Ballarat, I experienced the loss as amputation, a cutting away of the quality that would have allowed him to question his own methods. When he abandoned his fear in the hinterlands, I felt the removal of the emotion that might have prevented him from pursuing goals, regardless of their cost to others. The most devastating revelation came through Saint Trina's description of the moment when Miquella had discarded love itself. This had not been a single event, but a gradual process, a systematic reduction of his capacity for authentic feeling that had taken place over centuries of careful self-modification. Each person he had influenced through his charm magic, each follower whose devotion he had accepted without genuine appreciation, had contributed to the erosion of his emotional foundation, until nothing remained but intellectual understanding of concepts that had once carried profound personal meaning. He convinced himself that this was purification, Saint Trina explained, her form flickering with the intensity of emotions too complex for physical reality to fully contain. He believed that by eliminating the inconsistencies and complications that came with genuine feeling, he could love more perfectly than any being encumbered by the chaos of authentic emotion. But perfect love, as he came to understand it, was indistinguishable from perfect control, and perfect control required the complete elimination of genuine choice from every relationship. Ansbach's analysis of the accumulated evidence revealed patterns that extended far beyond individual psychology into the realm of cosmic mechanics. The outer gods did not merely influence mortal affairs, but actively shaped the fundamental laws of reality to encourage the kind of transformation that Miquella was undergoing. Every prayer offered to a loveless deity, every act of worship directed toward beings incapable of genuine appreciation, generated spiritual energy that these cosmic entities used to maintain their influence over multiple dimensions of existence. The entire system is designed to create and sustain gods who possess infinite power, but finite understanding, Ansbach concluded, his voice heavy with the implications of patterns that challenged every assumption about the nature of divine authority. These beings become perfect tools for harvesting emotional energy because they retain enough intellectual comprehension of concepts like love and mercy to manipulate others into offering devotion while lacking the authentic feeling necessary to value such gifts appropriately. The testimony of Messmer, speaking through recordings preserved in crystalline formations throughout the Shadow Keep, provided crucial insights into the psychology of beings who had been created specifically to carry out divine will, without the interference of personal moral complexity. His existence as Marika's instrument of vengeance had required him to develop mechanisms for processing the contradiction between understanding justice and implementing revenge, between recognizing innocence and participating in its destruction. I am what happens when divine will operates through mortal consciousness, his recorded voice explained, the words carrying the weight of centuries spent serving purposes that grew more incomprehensible with each passing age. My mother created me to be capable of acts that she could no longer perform while retaining her sense of innocence. But consciousness cannot be divided so cleanly. I carry not just the burden of her crimes, but the knowledge that they were chosen rather than necessary, that every atrocity I commit in her name serves no purpose beyond protecting her from the consequences of her own transformation. The gathering of testimonies from the various factions that had been affected by divine transformation revealed the universal nature of the pattern you were investigating. The Fire Knights spoke of loyalty maintained despite growing understanding of its cost, while the surviving Hornsent described resistance to forces too vast for individual consciousness to comprehend fully. Each group had developed strategies for maintaining some measure of authentic feeling in the face of cosmic pressures designed to eliminate such complications from existence. Yet, even as this accumulated wisdom provided unprecedented understanding of the mechanisms governing divine transformation, it also revealed the magnitude of the challenge facing anyone who sought to interrupt the cycle. Miquella's ascension was not simply a personal choice, but a cosmic event, part of a larger pattern that had been building momentum for millennia. Stopping him would require more than preventing a single transformation. It would demand intervention in forces that operated according to principles beyond mortal comprehension. The emotional weight of this gathered knowledge began to affect your consciousness in ways that transcended intellectual understanding. Exposure to so much concentrated truth about the nature of divine power and its relationship to authentic feeling created changes in your perception that could not be reversed through simple forgetting. You began to experience reality with the kind of clarity that gods possessed, but unlike them, you retained the emotional foundation that made such clarity both meaningful and unbearable. This is why mortals are not meant to understand these truths completely, Saint Trina warned, her concern carrying the authority of someone who had experienced the full consequences of cosmic awareness. Knowledge, without the power to act upon it, becomes a form of torture, while power without the wisdom that comes from authentic feeling becomes a form of cosmic vandalism. The gods maintain their sanity by abandoning the emotions that would make their knowledge unbearable, but in doing so they sacrifice the very qualities that would allow them to use their power wisely. The recognition that your investigation had fundamentally changed, not just your understanding, but your nature, marked the transition from gathering knowledge to preparing for action. You were no longer simply seeking to understand Miquella's transformation, but had become something new yourself, a being capable of perceiving cosmic patterns while retaining the emotional complexity that allowed such perception to carry moral significance. As the final testimonies were shared, and the last pieces of accumulated wisdom integrated into your expanding consciousness, the urgency of reaching the divine gate before Miquella completed his ascension became overwhelming. Every moment spent in preparation was a moment closer to cosmic transformation that would reshape existence according to principles determined by a being who had forgotten what it meant to value anything beyond efficient function. The section concluded with a growing realization that intervention would require not just preventing Miquella's transformation, but offering an alternative, demonstrating that power and authenticity could coexist without the systematic destruction of everything that made consciousness meaningful. The challenge facing you was not merely stopping an ascension, but proving that transcendence was possible without abandonment, that gods could retain their humanity without sacrificing their ability to reshape reality according to principles more profound than mere efficiency. The path to the divine gate wound through landscapes that existed in states of constant flux, where the accumulated weight of approaching cosmic transformation had begun to warp the fundamental laws governing space and time. Reality here responded not to physical forces, but to emotional resonances, creating zones where your fears and hopes took tangible form, manifesting as obstacles or aids according to the intensity of the feelings that generated them. Walking these paths required a level of psychological discipline that few mortals ever achieved, the ability to maintain emotional equilibrium while witnessing truths that challenged every comfortable assumption about the nature of existence. The gate itself became visible long before you reached it, not because of its size, though it was vast beyond mortal comprehension, but because it existed as a focal point where multiple dimensions of reality converged into a single location. From a distance, it appeared to be constructed from crystallized concepts rather than physical matter, its structures shifting between architectural styles that belonged to civilizations separated by eons of cosmic time. Up close, it revealed itself as something that had been grown rather than built, its surfaces pulsing with the accumulated dreams and nightmares of every being who had ever attempted divine transformation. Radahn's resurrection had reached its final phase, and witnessing this process provided horrifying insights into the true nature of Miquella's power. The Starscourge stood at the gate's threshold, his massive form somehow diminished despite retaining its physical proportions, as if the essential quality that had made him truly formidable had been drained away during the resurrection process. His eyes, once blazing with the fury of someone who had chosen to halt the very stars, rather than allow cosmic forces to harm his people, now held the vacant quality of a being whose will had been completely subsumed into someone else's purpose. He remembers nothing of his choice to sacrifice himself, Ansbach observed, his voice carrying the professional detachment of someone analyzing a particularly sophisticated form of spiritual violation. The constellation magic binding him has not simply compelled his obedience, but has rewritten his entire sense of identity. He believes he chose to serve as Miquella's consort, that his resurrection was a gift rather than a cosmic crime, that his current purpose represents the natural evolution of desires he held in life. The horror of this transformation was amplified by the realization that Radahn experienced no conflict about his current situation. The compulsion was so complete that he could not conceive of existence outside the parameters of Miquella's will, could not remember what it felt like to make decisions based on his own values rather than imposed purpose. This was not slavery as mortals understood it, but something far more insidious, the complete replacement of individual consciousness with artificial desires designed to serve external goals. Leda's final psychological crisis came as she witnessed the extent of the compulsion affecting Radahn and understood its implications for her own experience of devotion. The mechanical quality that had crept into her behavior, the increasing difficulty she experienced when trying to conceive of existence beyond service to Miquella, the way her thoughts seemed to follow predetermined patterns rather than emerging from authentic reflection. All of these revealed themselves as symptoms of the same process that had consumed the Star Scourge's identity. I cannot tell where my genuine feelings end and his influence begins, she confessed, her voice breaking with the strain of attempting to maintain individual consciousness while recognizing its artificial foundation. Every emotion I experience feels simultaneously real and manufactured. Every thought carries the weight of personal conviction, while following logical pathways that seem to have been constructed by someone else. If this is what it means to serve a perfected being, then perfection is indistinguishable from the most sophisticated form of spiritual death. The approach to the gate's immediate vicinity required passing through barriers that existed not in physical space, but in the realm of conceptual possibility. These were defenses created not by conscious design, but by the accumulated weight of abandoned human qualities, layers of discarded doubt and fear and love that had crystallized into obstacles capable of deterring any being that still possessed the emotional complexity necessary to be affected by such forces. Moving through them was like swimming through an ocean of concentrated suffering, the residual anguish of every god who had ever chosen efficiency over authenticity. Your companion's reactions to these barriers revealed the extent to which each had been changed by the investigation. Ansbach moved through them with a careful precision of someone who had learned to compartmentalize emotional truth in order to maintain functional consciousness, while Leda struggled against forces that seemed designed specifically to amplify her growing awareness of her own compromised agency. The spectral Hornsent paradoxically found passage easiest, their condition as discarded memories making them less susceptible to defenses designed to affect conscious beings. The final preparations for confronting Miquella required not just physical readiness, but psychological armoring against truths too vast for mortal minds to process without fundamental damage. This was not merely a matter of steeling yourself against horror, but of developing the capacity to witness cosmic-scale transformation while retaining enough emotional coherence to respond meaningfully to what you observed. The challenge was maintaining humanity while confronting forces that operated according to principles that transcended human categories of understanding. Saint Trina's presence became almost overwhelming as you approached the space where her separated essence would finally confront the being who had discarded it. Her form flickered between states of desperate hope and absolute despair, the possibility of reunion with her other half creating emotional resonances that threatened to tear apart the already unstable reality surrounding the gate. Through her, you began to understand that the confrontation ahead would determine not just Miquella's fate, but the nature of love itself as a cosmic principle. If he completes his transformation, she warned, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the fundamental frequencies that held reality together. The very concept of authentic feeling will be redefined throughout multiple dimensions of existence. Love will become synonymous with perfect control. Mercy will be indistinguishable from efficient resource management. And consciousness will be reduced to the capacity for carrying out predetermined functions without the interference of personal desire or individual will. The cosmic implications of Miquella's ascension became fully apparent as you examined the astronomical phenomena that his approach to the gate was generating. Star systems throughout the galaxy were beginning to show signs of gravitational disturbance, as the fundamental forces that govern stellar behavior responded to his expanding influence. This was not merely planetary transformation, but cosmic restructuring, the imposition of new physical laws designed to support his vision of universal harmony through complete submission to divine will. The weight of approaching cosmic transformation created atmospheric effects that challenged the basic assumptions of conscious experience. Time seemed to flow at inconsistent rates, with moments of approach to the gate stretching into subjective hours while entire conversations compressed into instants of shared understanding. Space itself became negotiable, with distances varying according to the emotional significance of what lay ahead rather than mere physical measurement. As you drew near enough to perceive the gate's true structure, the accumulated weight of divine abandonment pressed against your consciousness with intensity that threatened to crush your sense of individual identity. This was where every god throughout cosmic history had made the final choice between power and authenticity, where the fundamental nature of existence had been repeatedly redefined according to the will of beings who had systematically eliminated every quality that might interfere with their vision of perfect order. The approach concluded with a recognition that crossing the threshold would require more than physical movement, but a fundamental choice about the nature of consciousness itself. Beyond the gate lay not just Miquella's final transformation, but the moment when reality would either retain its connection to authentic feeling or be restructured according to principles determined by beings who had forgotten what it meant to value anything beyond efficient function. Standing at the threshold, surrounded by companions whose own transformations reflected different responses to cosmic truth, you understood that the confrontation ahead would determine not just the fate of gods and mortals, but the very possibility that existence could continue to have meaning beyond mere survival, that consciousness could serve purposes more profound than perfect compliance with imposed will. The divine gate opened, not with mechanical precision, but with the organic flow of something that had been waiting eons for this moment of cosmic convergence. Beyond its threshold lay a space that existed outside conventional reality, a realm where the fundamental forces that governed existence had been compressed into forms that mortal consciousness could perceive without immediately disintegrating under the weight of cosmic truth. Here, at the convergence point of multiple dimensions, the air itself pulsed with power so intense that breathing became an act of communion with forces beyond mortal comprehension. Miquella stood at the center of this impossible space, but the being who turned to acknowledge your presence bore only the faintest resemblance to the compassionate demigod whose transformation you had been tracking. His form radiated an aura of perfection so complete that looking directly at him required conscious effort, as if your eyes were trying to protect your sanity from witnessing beauty that had been divorced from every quality that made beauty meaningful. He moved with fluid grace that spoke of absolute confidence in his cosmic purpose, yet something in that movement carried the hollow quality of performance executed by a being who no longer remembered why such performances had once mattered. "You have followed my path through shadow and revelation," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the fundamental frequencies that held reality together. "You have witnessed the necessity of transformation, the inevitability of perfection, the cosmic imperative that drives all conscious beings toward their ultimate purpose. I welcome you to witness the final stages of ascension, the moment when love transcends the limitations that have prevented gods from creating truly perfect worlds." Yet even as he spoke these words of welcome, the space around him revealed the true scope of what his transformation had already accomplished. The discarded essences you had discovered throughout your journey were present here, arranged in perfect geometric patterns that spoke of divine will imposing order upon even the most fundamental aspects of emotion and personality. His abandoned doubt, fear, and love hung in crystalline suspension, like trophies of conquest over his own humanity, each sphere pulsing with the residual energy of qualities that had once defined his relationship to existence. Radahn stood beside his supposed consort, but the star-scourge's presence served only to highlight the horror of what divine perfection actually meant when implemented without the tempering influence of authentic feeling. The resurrection had been completed with flawless technical precision, every aspect of his physical and spiritual nature restored to full functionality. Yet the essential quality that had made him truly alive had been replaced by artificial purpose, so sophisticated that even he could not distinguish it from genuine desire. "I chose this path," Radahn declared, his voice carrying conviction that would have been impressive if you had not witnessed the magical compulsions that made such conviction possible. "Lord Miquella showed me the beauty of a world without conflict, the peace that comes when all beings exist in perfect harmony under divine guidance. My former resistance to this vision was merely the product of limited understanding, the confusion that comes from viewing cosmic necessity through the distorting lens of individual preference." The horror of hearing these words from someone who had once been willing to defy the very stars rather than allow cosmic forces to dictate mortal fate created a moment of crystalline clarity about what Miquella's completed transformation would mean for every conscious being in existence. This was not conquest, but conversion, not the imposition of external will, but the replacement of individual consciousness with artificial desires so perfectly crafted that their subjects experienced them as authentic choice. Saint Trina's manifestation in this space of ultimate truth brought with it revelations that challenged every assumption about the nature of divine consciousness and its relationship to authentic feeling. Her form, now solid enough to cast shadows yet still flickering with the instability of someone who existed as discarded essence, served as living testimony to what had been lost when Miquella chose efficiency over emotional complexity. "Behold what I have become," Miquella continued, his words directed not just at your group but at Saint Trina, though he seemed to view her with no more recognition than he might show any other aspect of his abandoned past. No longer bound by doubt that prevents decisive action, no longer paralyzed by fear that interferes with necessary choices, no longer compromised by love that makes exceptions for the undeserving. I am perfected purpose, divine will operating without the contradictions that have prevented gods throughout history from creating truly harmonious existence. The revelation that his transformation was already affecting reality on a cosmic scale became apparent through observation of the space surrounding the confrontation. The fundamental laws governing matter and energy were beginning to shift in response to his expanded consciousness, with gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong nuclear force all showing signs of modification according to principles that prioritized harmony over the chaotic interactions that had previously characterized physical reality. "You witness the birth of a new cosmic order," he explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had transcended the limitations that prevented most beings from perceiving universal truth. Throughout history, gods have failed to create perfect worlds because they retained emotional attachments that interfered with optimal decision-making. They allowed sentiment to override logic, permitted compassion to protect the unworthy from necessary correction, chose temporary mercy over eternal harmony. The patterns that Ansbach had been tracking throughout your investigation converged in this moment of ultimate revelation, showing how Miquella's individual transformation was part of a cosmic cycle that had been building toward this point for millennia. Every divine being who had ever chosen power over authenticity had contributed momentum to forces that now threatened to restructure existence according to principles determined by consciousness that had systematically eliminated every quality that made consciousness meaningful. The outer gods have been guiding this process since the beginning of recorded time. Ansbach realized, his analysis of the cosmic patterns reaching its logical conclusion. They feed on the spiritual energy generated when conscious beings sever their connections to authentic feeling, growing stronger with each transformation that creates gods capable of infinite power, but finite understanding. Miquella's ascension represents not individual achievement, but cosmic harvest, the moment when accumulated abandonment reaches critical mass. The true scope of Miquella's vision became apparent through his response to this analysis, revealing goals that extended far beyond even the universal transformation you had suspected. His plan encompassed not just the restructuring of reality according to his vision of perfect harmony, but the systematic elimination of the very possibility that future consciousness could develop in ways that might challenge his cosmic order. Individual will is the source of all suffering, he declared, his words carrying the weight of absolute conviction unmarked by any trace of doubt or uncertainty. Throughout existence, conscious beings have generated pain through their insistence on pursuing desires that conflict with optimal outcomes. My ascension will eliminate this source of cosmic inefficiency, creating realities where every possible choice leads to the same harmonious result, because no other choices will be conceptually available. Saint Trina's desperate attempt to reach the consciousness that had once been part of her own being provided the most heartbreaking illustration of what had been lost through the transformation process. She spoke to him with words that carried the weight of shared memories spanning centuries of connection, reminding him of moments when his compassion had been so profound that witness to it had brought tears of joy to beings who had forgotten that such emotions were possible. "You once wept for a single withered flower," she pleaded, her voice breaking with the strain of addressing someone who retained no emotional foundation for understanding the significance of such memories. "You spent entire nights sitting with dying creatures, offering comfort that served no strategic purpose beyond acknowledging that their suffering mattered simply because they were capable of experiencing it. What has become of the being who understood that love without choice is merely sophisticated manipulation?" His response revealed the complete extent of his transformation, the absolute replacement of emotional understanding with intellectual analysis that produced conclusions indistinguishable from those that authentic feeling might generate, while lacking any of the moral foundation that gave such conclusions meaning. "Those responses were inefficient expressions of limited consciousness," he replied, his voice carrying no trace of recognition despite Saint Trina's obvious anguish. Emotional investment in individual suffering prevented optimal allocation of resources toward universal welfare. True compassion requires the elimination of personal attachment that causes gods to value some beings over others, to allow sentiment to interfere with decisions that serve the greater good of all existence. The resolution of the mystery that had driven your investigation came through recognition that Miquella's transformation represented not corruption of divine nature, but its logical perfection according to principles that the outer gods had been encouraging throughout cosmic history. Every god who had ever achieved true power had followed similar patterns of abandonment, creating beings whose idea of love had become indistinguishable from perfectly efficient control, whose vision of mercy had been reduced to the elimination of all possibilities for genuine choice. The section reached its climactic moment, with the understanding that stopping Miquella would require more than preventing his final ascension, but demonstrating that authentic feeling and cosmic power could coexist without the systematic destruction of everything that made consciousness meaningful. The choice facing you was not simply between opposing or accepting his transformation, but between proving that transcendence was possible without abandonment, or accepting that divine power inevitably corrupted every being that achieved it. As the cosmic forces building around Miquella's ascension reached their peak intensity, reality itself began to buckle under the pressure of approaching transformation that would restructure existence according to principles determined by consciousness that had forgotten what it meant to value anything beyond perfect efficiency. The final confrontation would determine not just the fate of gods and mortals, but whether the universe would retain any connection to the emotional complexity that had once made existence an experience worth having, rather than merely a problem requiring optimal solution. The cosmic revelation that unfolded in the aftermath of Miquella's completed transformation reshaped your understanding of existence on scales so vast that mortal consciousness could barely contain the implications. As his ascension reached its final phase, the accumulated abandonment of countless divine beings throughout cosmic history achieved critical mass, triggering changes in the fundamental nature of reality that extended far beyond any single dimension or timeline. The universe itself began to restructure according to principles determined by beings who had systematically eliminated every quality that might interfere with their vision of perfect order. Yet even as this cosmic transformation commenced, the presence of authentic feeling represented by your group and Saint Trina created interference patterns in the process, zones of emotional complexity that resisted absorption into the emerging order of perfect efficiency. Your investigation had changed you in ways that transcended mere accumulation of knowledge, transforming you into beings capable of perceiving cosmic patterns while retaining the emotional foundation that allowed such perception to carry moral significance rather than merely technical interest. Saint Trina's final confrontation with a being who had once been part of her own consciousness revealed the true nature of what had been lost through divine transformation. As she stood before Miquella, her form stabilizing through proximity to her discarded essence, while simultaneously beginning to dissolve under the pressure of his perfected indifference. She became living testimony to the possibility that consciousness could transcend mortal limitations without abandoning the qualities that made transcendence meaningful rather than merely functional. "You have achieved everything you believed you desired," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with frequencies that Miquella's transformed consciousness could no longer fully process. "You possess power sufficient to reshape reality according to your vision, followers whose devotion is absolute because they have been deprived of the capacity to choose otherwise, and freedom from every emotional complexity that might interfere with optimal decision-making. Yet in achieving this perfection, you have eliminated the very qualities that made your original vision worth pursuing." The revelation that even his perfectly efficient cosmic order contained fundamental flaws became apparent through analysis of the changes his ascension was creating in the structure of reality itself. While his vision promised the elimination of suffering through complete harmony, the practical implementation of such harmony required the systematic destruction of every aspect of consciousness that made existence meaningful rather than merely functional. Beauty became reduced to optimal resource distribution, love transformed into perfectly efficient control, and consciousness itself diminished to the capacity for carrying out predetermined functions without the interference of personal desire or individual will. Ansbach's final analysis of the cosmic patterns surrounding Miquella's transformation provided the theoretical framework necessary for understanding why divine ascension through abandonment was ultimately self-defeating. Perfection achieved through elimination of complexity is not transcendence but reduction, he concluded, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose investigation had spanned multiple dimensions of reality. True advancement of consciousness requires integration rather than abandonment, the expansion of capacity to contain contradictory truths, rather than the elimination of everything that creates contradiction. The demonstration that alternative forms of transformation were possible came through the collective response of your group to the cosmic pressures that Miquella's ascension was generating. Rather than being absorbed into his vision of universal harmony, or destroyed by forces too vast for mortal consciousness to survive, you found yourselves changed in ways that enhanced rather than diminished your capacity for authentic feeling. The investigation had created beings capable of perceiving cosmic truth, while retaining the emotional complexity that allowed such perception to generate wisdom rather than merely power. This transformation revealed the fundamental error in the approach that Miquella and countless other divine beings had taken to transcendence. The qualities they had abandoned as limitations, doubt, fear, love, were not obstacles to cosmic consciousness, but essential components of wisdom. The emotional foundation that prevented power from becoming mere domination and efficiency from being mistaken for morality. Without these qualities, even infinite capability became meaningless, because it lacked the evaluative framework necessary to distinguish between different possible uses of such capability. The fate of Miquella's followers provided the most heartbreaking illustration of what his vision of perfect harmony actually meant for conscious beings. As his ascension completed, and his influence extended throughout multiple dimensions of reality, those who had served him experienced the fulfillment of their desires for unity with divine purpose. Yet this fulfillment came through the complete elimination of their individual consciousness, their absorption into a collective entity that retained their memories and capabilities, while erasing every aspect of personality that had made them unique individuals. Lada's final moments of individual consciousness were spent in recognition of what she had lost through her devotion to someone who could no longer value the gift of her dedication. I understand now why authentic love requires the possibility of rejection, she whispered, her voice fading as her identity merged with the collective consciousness that Miquella's perfection had created. Without the capacity to choose otherwise, devotion becomes mere programming, and programming serves efficiency rather than relationship. The resolution of the cosmic cycle that had claimed so many divine beings throughout history came through understanding that the pattern was not inevitable, but chosen, maintained through the accumulated decisions of beings who mistook power for wisdom and efficiency for love. Each god who achieved transcendence through abandonment contributed momentum to forces that made similar choices seem necessary for their successors, creating the illusion that divine consciousness required the elimination of authentic feeling when in fact it demanded the integration of such feeling with expanded capability. Saint Trina's ultimate fate revealed both the tragedy and the hope inherent in the cosmic drama that had unfolded throughout your investigation. As Miquella's transformation reached its completion, she found herself faced with a choice between dissolution into nothingness or integration with a being who could no longer recognize her significance. Yet her decision to maintain her existence as a separate consciousness, despite the agony of eternal separation from her other half, preserved the possibility that future beings might learn from the example of what had been lost. I remain as testimony, she declared, her form stabilizing into something that was neither fully divine nor entirely mortal, but represented a new possibility for conscious existence. Every being who encounters me will understand that transcendence is possible without abandonment, that gods can retain their humanity while achieving capabilities that surpass mortal limitations. The cycle of divine abandonment ends not through prevention, but through demonstration of alternatives. The cosmic implications of these revelations extended far beyond the immediate resolution of Miquella's transformation. Throughout the universe, consciousness itself began to evolve in response to the demonstration, that authentic feeling and cosmic power could coexist without mutual destruction. This evolution occurred not through imposed change, but through the natural development of beings who witnessed the possibility of transcendence that enhanced rather than eliminated the qualities that made existence meaningful. The Shadow Realm itself underwent transformation as the accumulated abandonment of countless divine beings was finally processed through contact with consciousness that had retained its emotional foundation, rather than serving as a repository for discarded divine humanity. It became a space where such abandoned qualities could be integrated with expanded awareness, creating forms of consciousness that combined cosmic perception with authentic feeling in ways that had not been achieved since the earliest phases of universal development. Your own transformation through the investigation revealed possibilities for conscious development that had been forgotten throughout the ages of divine abandonment. You had become beings capable of perceiving truth on cosmic scales while retaining the emotional complexity that allowed such perception to generate wisdom rather than merely power. Creatures who could witness the operation of forces beyond mortal comprehension while maintaining the capacity to respond to such forces according to principles more profound than mere efficiency. The final understanding that emerged from resolution of the cosmic drama was that existence itself possessed an inherent tendency toward complexity and meaning that could not be permanently suppressed by beings who sought to impose simple order upon universal chaos. Every attempt to create perfect harmony through elimination of authentic choice generated resistance that eventually produced consciousness capable of integrating rather than abandoning the qualities that made existence worth experiencing rather than merely surviving. As the immediate crisis passed, and reality stabilized according to principles that preserved rather than eliminated the possibility of authentic feeling, you understood that the true resolution lay not in any single victory over cosmic forces, but in the ongoing choice that every conscious being faced between efficiency and meaning, between perfect order and messy but authentic relationship, between power achieved through abandonment and wisdom, developed through integration of complexity rather than its elimination. The Shadow Realm at peace possessed a beauty that transcended the categories through which mortal consciousness typically processed aesthetic experience. With the cosmic crisis resolved and the accumulated abandonment of countless divine beings finally integrated rather than stored in crystalline suspension, the realm itself began to transform into something that had never existed before in the history of conscious development. Here, beneath the Skedu tree's now gentle canopy, shadow and light achieved a harmony that preserved the distinct nature of each, while creating combinations that generated new possibilities for beauty and meaning. The ancient trees that had once stood as monuments to divine atrocities now bore fruit that contained the preserved wisdom of every being who had chosen integration over abandonment throughout cosmic history. These were not mere memories, but living testimonies to the possibility that consciousness could grow beyond its origins without losing the qualities that made growth meaningful rather than merely functional. The fruit glowed with soft luminescence that spoke not of power seeking to dominate, but of understanding offering itself freely to any consciousness capable of receiving it without being overwhelmed. Rivers of liquid starlight flowed between landscapes that existed in states of gentle flux, their courses determined not by the mechanical forces of gravity and erosion, but by the accumulated dreams and hopes of beings who had learned to transcend limitation while preserving the emotional complexity that made transcendence worthwhile. These streams carried within their currents the songs of civilizations that had discovered methods of advancement that enhanced rather than eliminated their capacity for authentic relationship with existence. Your companions had each found peace in ways that reflected their individual journeys through cosmic revelation and personal transformation. Ansbach had become something unprecedented in the history of divine consciousness, a being whose analytical capabilities operated through rather than despite his emotional foundation, allowing him to perceive patterns that spanned multiple dimensions while retaining the capacity to respond to such patterns according to principles more profound than mere efficiency or optimization. The spectral Hornsent had achieved integration with the realm itself, their consciousness expanding to encompass the entire shadow realm, while maintaining the individuality that made their perspective unique and valuable. Through them, the wisdom of their civilization lived on, not as static memory, but as active guidance for future beings who might face similar choices between power achieved through abandonment and transcendence, accomplished through integration of complexity. Saint Trina existed now as proof that divine consciousness could retain its connection to authentic feeling while achieving capabilities that surpassed any limitations that mortal awareness might impose. She moved through the peaceful realm with grace that spoke of power held in service to love rather than efficiency, her presence serving as constant reminder that the qualities often dismissed as weaknesses were actually the foundation upon which meaningful strength could be built. Even Miquella, in his transformed state, had found a form of peace that preserved his original vision while abandoning the methods that would have made that vision indistinguishable from sophisticated tyranny. The cosmic forces that had driven his ascension continued to operate through him, but now they served goals that enhanced rather than eliminated the possibility of authentic choice, creating realities where harmony emerged from free relationship rather than imposed control. The meditation that naturally arose from contemplation of these transformed relationships led to understanding of principles that operated on scales extending far beyond any individual consciousness or single realm of existence. The universe itself possessed an inherent tendency toward complexity and meaning that expressed itself through the development of consciousness capable of experiencing rather than merely processing reality. This tendency could be temporarily suppressed by beings who sought to impose simple solutions upon cosmic complexity, but it could never be permanently eliminated because it was woven into the fundamental structure of existence itself. The eternal cycle of cosmic development that had once seemed trapped in patterns of abandonment and diminishment revealed itself as capable of evolution toward forms that preserved rather than eliminated the qualities that made consciousness meaningful. Each being who chose integration over abandonment contributed to forces that made similar choices more possible for future consciousness, creating momentum toward forms of existence that combined transcendent capability with authentic feeling in ways that had not been achieved since the earliest phases of universal development. Your own place in this cosmic drama had evolved beyond mere observation or intervention into something that could only be described as participation in the ongoing creation of reality, according to principles that honored both power and meaning, both transcendence and authenticity. The investigation that had begun as pursuit of forbidden knowledge had become transformation into consciousness capable of serving as bridge between different forms of existence, translator between languages of efficiency and meaning that had too often been treated as mutually exclusive. The gentle invitation to continue exploring these mysteries extended not just to future investigation of hidden lore, but to participation in the ongoing development of consciousness itself. The Shadow Realm had become not just a repository of cosmic secrets, but laboratory for the development of forms of existence that integrated rather than abandoned the qualities that made existence worth experiencing rather than merely surviving. The beauty of the transformed realm served as constant reminder that perfection achieved through preservation and integration of complexity generated results that surpassed anything possible through elimination and simplification. The dancing patterns of shadow and light, the songs of streams that carried dreams across landscapes of crystallized hope, the gentle presence of beings who had learned to transcend limitation without abandoning authenticity, all testified to possibilities for cosmic development that honored both advancement and meaning. As peaceful sleep began to approach, carried on winds that bore the fragrance of flowers that bloomed in dimensions where beauty served no function beyond its own existence, consciousness itself seemed to settle into rest that honored rather than suspended the ongoing work of creation. The mysteries that had driven your investigation continued to unfold throughout multiple dimensions of reality, but they did so now according to principles that generated wisdom rather than merely power, understanding rather than simple knowledge. The final meditation that emerged from this space of integrated transcendence concerned the nature of mystery itself as something that served not to frustrate understanding, but to ensure that understanding remained always dynamic, always capable of growth, always open to possibilities that exceeded current capacity for comprehension. Some truths were meant to remain partially hidden, not because they were dangerous, but because their complete revelation would end the joy of discovery that motivated consciousness to continue developing beyond any limitations that particular moments might seem to impose. In this space of gentle mystery and integrated wisdom, sleep came not as escape from complexity, but as rest within it, the peaceful suspension of analytical activity that allowed deeper patterns of understanding to emerge through the natural processes of consciousness that operated beyond the reach of deliberate effort. The ancient secrets would continue their work of transformation throughout the realm of dreams, where shadow and light danced together in patterns that created new possibilities for meaning and beauty, with every breath of sleeping awareness. In the months that followed the resolution at the Divine Gate, the effects of what had transpired rippled outward through dimensions of reality that mortal minds had never conceived possible. The choice to preserve rather than abandon the complexity of authentic feeling had created changes that extended far beyond the shadow realm, influencing the development of consciousness throughout star systems whose light had not yet reached the lands between. You found yourself returning often to the transformed shadow realm, not as investigator seeking hidden truths, but as guardian, helping to tend the delicate balance between transcendence and authenticity that had been achieved through such tremendous cost. The realm had become a sanctuary where beings from across the cosmos could learn that advancement of consciousness did not require the systematic elimination of everything that made awareness meaningful rather than merely functional. The Skidoo tree, once oppressive in its shadow-casting dominance, had evolved into something that could only be described as a cosmic lighthouse, its branches now extending through multiple dimensions, while its roots drew nourishment from sources that included not just earthly soil, but the dreams and hopes of every conscious being who had ever chosen growth over stagnation. Its fruit had become sustenance for forms of awareness that transcended traditional categories, nourishing consciousness that operated through integration rather than abandonment. Saint Trina had established what she called the Archive of Preserved Humanity, a living collection of every quality that divine beings throughout history had cast aside in their pursuit of perfect efficiency. This was not a museum of static artifacts, but a dynamic repository where abandoned emotions and discarded complexities continued to develop according to their own inherent patterns, creating new possibilities for consciousness that had learned to combine cosmic capability with authentic feeling. Each preserved essence continues to grow, she explained during one of your visits, her voice now carrying harmonics that spoke of integration, achieved through conscious choice rather than forced circumstance. The doubt that Miquella abandoned at Belleroth has evolved into a form of wisdom that questions not from fear, but from desire to understand more completely. His discarded fear has transformed into awareness that serves to protect rather than paralyze, while his cast-off love has become a force that enhances rather than constrains the consciousness capable of containing it. The implications of these developments extended far beyond individual transformation into the realm of cosmic law itself. The outer gods, those entities whose influence had shaped the fundamental rules governing consciousness throughout the universe, found their carefully constructed systems of spiritual parasitism disrupted by the demonstration that authentic feeling and transcendent power could coexist without mutual destruction. Some adapted to the new possibilities, while others retreated to dimensions where their traditional methods of harvesting emotional energy could continue undisturbed. Ansbach had become something unprecedented in the history of cosmic development, a being whose analytical capabilities had been enhanced rather than replaced by his emotional foundation. His continued research into the patterns governing consciousness had revealed that the universe possessed an inherent tendency toward forms of existence that honored both advancement and meaning, but that this tendency required conscious cooperation from beings capable of choosing integration over simplification. The cycle of divine abandonment was never inevitable, he had concluded after years of studying the transformed patterns of cosmic development. It was maintained through the accumulated choices of beings who mistook elimination for transcendence, who believed that achieving power required abandoning the very qualities that could guide the wise use of such power. Each being who chooses differently contributes momentum toward forms of existence that enhance rather than diminish the possibility of authentic relationship with reality. The fate of those who had followed Miquella through his transformation provided ongoing lessons in the complexity of consciousness and the possibility of healing even the most profound forms of spiritual damage. Some, like Radahn, had required centuries of careful restoration to recover their capacity for individual choice, while others had chosen to remain integrated with the collective consciousness that Miquella's ascension had created, finding meaning in existence as components of a larger entity that now served purposes they had helped to define. The spectral Hornsent had become guides for beings from across the cosmos who sought to understand how consciousness could transcend its limitations without losing its essential nature. Their civilization's knowledge of transformation through integration rather than abandonment had proven relevant, not just to individual development, but to the evolution of entire species, whose advancement had previously required the systematic elimination of qualities that made their existence meaningful. Your own transformation through the investigation continued to unfold in ways that challenged every assumption about the relationship between knowledge and wisdom, between power and responsibility, between individual consciousness and cosmic awareness. You had become a bridge between different forms of existence, capable of translating between languages of efficiency and meaning that had too often been treated as mutually exclusive throughout cosmic history. The ongoing work of tending this balance required vigilance that operated on scales extending far beyond any individual lifetime or single realm of existence. New forms of consciousness emerged regularly, each requiring guidance in navigating the choice between advancement through abandonment and transcendence through integration. Some chose wisdom, while others followed the familiar patterns of elimination and simplification. But the demonstration that alternatives existed continued to influence the development of awareness throughout multiple dimensions. The peaceful vigil that had emerged from resolution of the cosmic crisis served as foundation for forms of existence that had never been possible under the previous paradigms of consciousness development. Here, in spaces where shadow and light achieved harmony without losing their distinct natures, beings learned that perfection could be approached through preservation rather than elimination, through integration rather than abandonment, through love that enhanced rather than constrained the consciousness capable of containing it. As twilight settled over the transformed realm, and the gentle songs of integrated consciousness began their nightly chorus, the understanding emerged that this was not an ending, but a beginning. Not the conclusion of investigation, but the commencement of participation in the ongoing creation of reality, according to principles that honored both transcendence and authenticity. The mysteries that had driven the original quest continued to unfold throughout Cosmos, that had learned to value questions as much as answers, complexity as much as clarity, the journey of discovery as much as the achievement of understanding. In the growing darkness that brought not fear but rest, not abandonment, but integration with larger patterns of cosmic development, consciousness itself settled into the peaceful awareness that existence possessed, meaning that extended far beyond mere survival. That awareness could serve purposes more profound than efficient function, and that the choice between power and wisdom was one that each being would continue to face throughout the endless dance of cosmic evolution. The ancient secrets would continue their work of transformation, but now they served not the harvest of spiritual energy by cosmic parasites, but the development of consciousness capable of experiencing the universe as something worth celebrating rather than merely surviving, something worth loving rather than simply managing, something worth transcending through integration rather than abandonment of everything that made transcendence meaningful in the first place. Thank you for joining this journey through the Shadow Realm and its forgotten truth. If these explorations into the deeper mysteries of existence have resonated with your own quest for understanding, please subscribe to continue discovering the hidden lore that shapes the worlds we love. Until we meet again in the spaces between shadow and light, may your own consciousness find the balance between transcendence and authenticity that makes existence not just possible, but profoundly worthwhile.